What happens when the road you're driving doesn't exist on any map? When your GPS leads you into a void where time moves backward and the fuel gauge defies physics? Tonight on Verified Fears, we're diving into 11 documented cases from the world's most haunted desert highways where travelers vanish without a trace. Phantom hitchhikers climb into moving vehicles, and the dead still patrol endless stretches of asphalt under starless skies. If you survived all 11 stories, you're part of the Verified Fears family now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell because we're just getting started with the world's most disturbing true horror accounts. Let's move to our first story. In the summer of 2019, the Martinez family was driving home to Los Angeles after a weekend camping trip in Joshua Tree National Park. It was supposed to be a simple 3-hour drive back on familiar highways. But what happened next would shatter their understanding of reality and leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about the roads they traveled. Melissa was behind the wheel of their Honda Pilot, with her husband Miguel in the passenger seat and their 2 kids, Emma and Josh, aged 12 and 9, sleeping in the back. They had taken this route dozens of times before. Interstate 10 West to Highway 62, then connecting to Route 375, Nevada's infamous extraterrestrial highway. What made this trip different was Miguel's new dashboard GPS system, a high-end Garmin unit he'd installed just the week before, complete with real-time traffic updates and satellite connectivity. The trouble began around 11:30 p.m. as they approached the Nevada border. Miguel noticed their regular GPS route was showing unusual congestion ahead, a massive red line indicating stop traffic for the next 40 miles. The new Garmin unit, however, was suggesting an alternate route that would save them nearly 2 hours. The suggested path showed a clearly marked highway branching off Route 375, labeled as Desert Bypass 375A on the GPS display. Miguel had never heard of this road, but the unit showed it as a legitimate state highway with a speed limit of 65 miles per hour. "I've never seen this road before," Melissa said, squinting at the GPS screen as they approached what should have been empty desert. But there it was, a perfectly paved 2-lane highway with fresh yellow lines and reflective markers exactly where the GPS indicated. The road even had an official Nevada Department of Transportation sign reading, Desert Bypass 375-A, Las Vegas 127 miles. Everything looked legitimate, from the road surface to the mile markers that began with DB-001. They turned onto the mysterious highway, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The road was smooth, well-maintained, and completely empty of other traffic. The kids remained asleep, and Melissa felt relieved to avoid the congestion their old GPS had warned about. But then Miguel noticed something odd about the mile markers. They were counting backward. DB-011 had become DB-011, then DB-9999, as if they were traveling in reverse through some impossible numbering system. "Melissa, look at the fuel gauge," Miguel whispered, not wanting to wake the children. The tank had been at half when they entered the bypass, but now it read completely full. They had been driving for over an hour on this strange road, yet somehow they had more fuel than when they started. The odometer wasn't moving either. It remained frozen at exactly 127,463 miles, the same reading from when they first turned onto the bypass. The GPS continued to cheerfully announce their progress, stating they were making excellent time and would arrive in Las Vegas ahead of schedule. But the estimated arrival time kept changing in impossible ways. First it showed 1:15 a.m., then 12:45 a.m., then 11:55 p.m., as if they were traveling backward through time itself. The timestamp on the GPS display confirmed this impossibility, showing the current time as 10:47 p.m., nearly an hour earlier than when they had entered the road. Melissa tried calling her sister in Las Vegas to let her know they were running ahead of schedule. But her cell phone showed no signal, not even the emergency calls only message that usually appeared in dead zones. The phone simply displayed no service area in a font she had never seen before, and the battery percentage kept fluctuating between 67% and 73% every few seconds. After what felt like 3 hours of driving, they passed the same distinctive rock formation 4 times. A towering red sandstone pillar that Miguel had photographed earlier because of its unusual shape. Each time they passed it, the mile marker beside it read DB500, as if they were trapped in some kind of loop. The children remained unnaturally asleep despite the growing tension in the car, their breathing synchronized in a way that seemed almost mechanical. "We need to turn around," Melissa said, her voice shaking. But when she tried to make a U-turn, the steering wheel wouldn't respond. The car continued straight down the endless highway, as if it had a mind of its own. The brake pedal went to the floor without slowing their speed, and the gear shift was locked in drive. They were passengers in their own vehicle, following a road that defied every law of physics and geography they knew. The GPS began announcing directions in a voice that wasn't quite the same as before, subtly different in pitch and cadence, as if the device had been replaced by something trying to imitate the original. "In 500 feet, continue straight on Desert Bypass 375A. Your destination is ahead." But there was no destination marked on the screen, just an endless green line stretching into digital infinity. As dawn approached, though the timestamp still insisted it was the middle of the night, Melissa noticed something even more disturbing. The road signs they passed were advertising businesses that couldn't possibly or exist. Desert Pete's 24-hour diner, next exit, established 2089, and Quantum Fuel Station, premium gasoline from tomorrow's refineries. The exits themselves led to perfect darkness, as if the side road simply ended at the edge of reality. Finally, after driving for what their internal clocks told them was nearly 6 hours, they saw a familiar sight ahead, the welcome sign for Las Vegas. But as they approached it, Melissa realized they were approaching from the wrong direction. They were entering the city from the east, coming from the direction of Arizona, when they should have been arriving from the north. According to their route, they had somehow traveled in a complete circle while driving perfectly straight. The moment they crossed the Las Vegas city limits, their car's systems returned to normal. The fuel gauge dropped to the level it should have been, the odometer began moving again, and their cell phones suddenly exploded with dozens of missed calls and messages. The timestamp corrected itself with an audible click, jumping forward to show the correct time, 6:23 a.m. They had lost exactly 7 hours. When Miguel checked the GPS history later that day, there was no record of Desert Bypass 375-A. The route they had taken appeared as a straight line from their campground to Las Vegas, with no deviation whatsoever. Nevada Department of Transportation had no record of any bypass road off Route 375, and satellite imagery showed nothing but empty desert where they had driven for hours. But the most unsettling detail came from their daughter Emma, who woke up as they pulled into their driveway. "Mom," she said sleepily, "I had the weirdest dream. I dreamed we were driving on a road that was driving us." When they asked her what she meant, she simply said, "The road was alive, and it was taking us somewhere we weren't supposed to go. But we weren't ready yet, so it let us leave." To this day, the Martinez family avoids Route 375 entirely. And Miguel never uses GPS navigation again, preferring to stick to roads he can find on paper maps. Roads he knows existed yesterday and will still exist tomorrow. Let's move to our second story. On a freezing February night in 2021, veteran long-haul trucker James was making his regular run from Phoenix to Salt Lake City along Interstate 15 through the Mojave Desert. James had been driving this route for over 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to construction materials, and he prided himself on knowing every mile marker, every rest stop, and every quirk of the highway. What happened that night would turn his most familiar route into a nightmare that still haunts him today. James was driving his Kenworth T680, pulling a fully loaded trailer of automotive parts, when he spotted a figure standing beside mile marker 13 around 2:30 a.m. The figure was clearly visible in his headlights, a young woman in her 20s wearing a white sundress and carrying a small suitcase. Completely inappropriate clothing for the near-freezing desert night. She had her thumb out and was looking directly at his approaching truck with an expression of desperate hope. In his 15 years of trucking, James had a strict policy about hitchhikers. He never picked them up. Company regulations prohibited it, and the liability issues alone were enough to keep him focused on his cargo rather than stranded travelers. But something about this woman made him reconsider. Maybe it was the fact that she was alone in the middle of nowhere at nearly 3 a.m., or maybe it was the way she seemed to be shivering in that thin dress. But James found himself slowing down and pulling over about 50 yards past the mile marker. He set his air brakes and climbed down from the cab, expecting to have a conversation through his passenger window about calling for proper roadside assistance. But when he looked back toward mile marker 13, the woman was already standing beside his passenger door, despite the fact that he had seen her in his mirrors just moments before. Still back at the mile marker. She couldn't have covered that distance so quickly, especially not in the delicate sandals he could now see she was wearing. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the desert wind. "I've been waiting here for so long." Her accent was distinctly from the 1960s, the kind of carefully enunciated speech patterns you heard in old movies, with elongated vowels and precise consonants that no one used anymore. When James looked at her more closely, everything about her seemed slightly off. Her hairstyle was a perfect bouffant that looked like it had been set in a beauty parlor earlier that day, and her makeup was flawless despite supposedly standing in the desert wind for hours. Against his better judgment and 15 years of company policy, James found himself opening the passenger door and helping her up into the cab. She settled into the seat with practiced ease, placing her small suitcase on her lap with both hands folded over it. The suitcase itself was vintage, genuine leather with brass hardware and travel. Stickers from places like Desert Springs Motor Lodge and Route 66 Diner, establishments that James was pretty sure hadn't existed for decades. "Where are you headed?" James asked as he climbed back into the driver's seat and released the air brakes. The woman smiled, but didn't answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to be studying the interior of the cab with fascination, as if she had never seen a modern truck before. Her eyes lingered on the GPS unit, the satellite radio, and the digital dashboard displays, with what looked like genuine confusion. "Just up the road a piece," she finally replied, using an expression James hadn't heard since his grandmother was alive. "You'll know when we get there." Something about her response made James uncomfortable, but he was already committed to helping her. And the highway stretched empty in both directions. He figured he could drop her at the next truck stop, which was about 30 miles ahead near Baker, California. As they drove, the woman began talking about her journey. She mentioned traveling from Los Angeles to visit her sister in Las Vegas, a trip she made every few months. But the details she provided didn't add up. She talked about gas prices that were decades out of date, mentioned stopping at roadside diners that James knew had been demolished years ago, and referred to movie stars and current events from the 1960s as if they were happening today. "The new Elvis picture is wonderful," she said at one point. "Have you seen it? Clam Bake just opened at the drive-in near Barstow." James realized she was talking about a movie that had been released in 1967, more than 50 years ago. When he gently pointed out that Elvis Presley had been dead for decades, she looked at him with genuine confusion and said, "Oh no, honey, I just heard him on the radio yesterday." The temperature inside the cab began to drop noticeably, despite the heater running at full blast. James could see his breath forming small clouds, and frost began appearing on the inside of the windows. The woman didn't seem to notice the cold at all, sitting comfortably in her thin summer dress, while James found himself shivering and reaching for his heavy jacket. About 20 miles down the road, James noticed something odd in his rearview mirror. Behind them, perfectly visible in the red glow of his taillights, he could see the woman's reflection. But it wasn't quite right. In the mirror, she appeared to be wearing different clothes. A dark coat and hat instead of the white sundress he could see with his own eyes. Her reflection was also gesturing frantically, as if trying to warn him about something, while the woman sitting beside him remained calm and composed. "You're a kind man for stopping," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Most people just drive right past mile marker 13 these days. They say it's unlucky, you know. They say terrible things have happened there." Her voice had taken on a different quality, sadder, more distant, as if she was speaking from very far away. James felt a chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. "What kind of terrible things?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The woman turned to look at him directly for the first time since she had gotten into the truck, and James noticed that her eyes reflected the dashboard lights like an animal's eyes would. A silvery, unnatural gleam that made his stomach clench with instinctive fear. "A young woman died there," she said quietly. "February 14th, 1967. Valentine's Day. She was hitchhiking to see her boyfriend in Las Vegas, going to surprise him with a marriage proposal. But she never made it. A drunk driver hit her right there at mile marker 13, sent her flying into the desert. They didn't find her body for 3 days." As she spoke, the temperature in the cab continued to plummet, and James realized he could no longer feel his fingers on the steering wheel. "Her name was Linda Sue Morrison," the woman continued, and James felt his blood turn to ice. "She was 23 years old, had her whole life ahead of her. She was wearing a white sundress her mother had made for her, and she was carrying a little suitcase with her engagement ring inside." The woman lifted the vintage suitcase on her lap and smiled sadly. "She's been trying to get to Las Vegas ever since. 54 years now, catching rides with kind truckers like yourself." James realized he was no longer breathing, and his hands were frozen to the steering wheel. In his rearview mirror, the reflection of the woman was now pointing urgently ahead, and James could see what she was pointing at. About a quarter mile up the road, the red and blue flashing lights of a police car were visible, and beyond that, the twisted wreckage of what looked like a serious accident. "You need to let me out here," Linda Sue said, her voice now barely a whisper. "This is where I get off." James tried to speak, tried to ask questions, but found that his voice had completely disappeared. The truck began slowing down on its own, the air brakes engaging automatically as they approached the accident scene. As the truck came to a complete stop, Linda Sue opened the passenger door and climbed down with the same graceful ease she had shown when getting in. She stood beside the truck for a moment, looking back up at James with an expression of infinite sadness. "Thank you for the ride," she said. "And don't worry about what you'll tell them. They'll understand." The moment she closed the door, the temperature in the cab returned to normal, and James found he could move and breathe again. He looked around frantically, but Linda Sue had vanished completely. There was no sign of her anywhere. No footprints in the sand, no indication that anyone had ever been in his truck at all. A state trooper approached his driver's side window, tapping on the glass with his flashlight. James rolled down the window, still shaking from his encounter. "You okay, driver?" the trooper asked. "We got a call about 15 minutes ago. Someone reported seeing a truck stopped at mile marker 13 with hazard lights flashing, but when we got there, nobody was around. We've been looking for you." James stammered out a confession about picking up a hitchhiker, describing Linda Sue in detail. The trooper's expression grew increasingly grim as James spoke. When he finished, the officer was quiet for a long moment before pulling out a worn notebook from his shirt pocket. "Driver, I've been working this stretch of highway for 12 years, the trooper said slowly. "And you're the 14th trucker who's reported picking up that exact same woman at mile marker 13. Every single one of them describes her the same way. White sundress, vintage suitcase, 1960s accent. Talks about Elvis like he's still alive." The officer flipped through several pages of notes. The first report was back in 1987. Trucker named Bill Henderson called it in, described her down to the color of her nail polish. The trooper closed his notebook and looked directly at James. "Here's what I'm going to tell you, and then we're both going to forget this conversation ever happened. 20 yards past mile marker 13, there's a small cross hidden in the sagebrush. It marks the spot where Linda Sue Morrison died on Valentine's Day, 1967. She was hitchhiking to Las Vegas to propose to her boyfriend, but she never made it. And according to every trucker who's ever picked her up, she's still trying to get there." James never drove Interstate 15 through the Mojave again. He requested permanent reassignment to routes that kept him in the eastern United States. And he never spoke about what happened that night until he retired 5 years later. But sometimes, on cold February nights, when the wind is howling outside his house in Phoenix, James says he can still smell the faint scent of 1960s perfume and hear the distant sound of a young woman's voice saying, "Thank you for stopping. I've been waiting here for so long." Let's move to our third story. In the autumn of 2018, veteran long-haul trucker Mason was hauling a load of construction equipment from Phoenix to Salt Lake City along Route 191, a lonely stretch of highway that cuts through some of the most desolate terrain on the Arizona-Utah border. Mason had been driving this route for over 20 years, and like most truckers, he relied heavily on his CB radio for company during the long, isolated hours between truck stops. What started as routine chatter on Channel 19 would become an encounter that still haunts him today and has left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the voices that travel the airwaves. Mason's Peterbilt 379 was equipped with a high-end Cobra 29LX CB radio, the same model he'd been running for the better part of a decade. The radio had served him well through countless trips across the country, picking up trucker chatter from distances that sometimes surprised even him. On this particular night, around 11:45 p.m., Mason was about 40 miles south of the Utah border when his CB began picking up transmissions that didn't sound quite right. The first voice came through on Channel 19, the standard highway frequency that truckers use for eastbound and westbound travel. It was a man's voice, speaking in the distinctive cadence of a seasoned driver. But something about the transmission quality was off. The signal was crystal clear, clearer than most local transmissions, but it had an odd echo to it, as if the speaker was talking from inside a large, empty space. The voice was discussing road conditions ahead, warning about construction near mile marker 47. But when Mason checked his atlas, there was no construction scheduled for that area. Breaker 19. This is Desert Ghost, eastbound at mile marker 47. The voice crackled through the speaker. Be advised, you got major construction ahead, boys. They got the whole northbound lane shut down for about 10 miles. Better find yourself an alternate route if you're running a schedule. The voice used proper CB protocol and trucker terminology, but something about the phrasing sounded outdated, like the kind of language drivers used back in the 1970s and 80s. Mason keyed his mic to respond, asking for clarification about the construction, but received no answer. He tried several more times over the next few minutes, but Desert Ghost had apparently moved out of range. When Mason reached mile marker 47 about 20 minutes later, there was no construction at all, just empty highway stretching endlessly through the desert night. The road was in perfect condition, and there were no signs of any recent or planned construction work. About an hour later, as Mason was approaching the area known locally as the Stretch, a particularly isolated 15-mile section where cell phone coverage was non-existent and CB signals were typically weak, his radio exploded with activity. Multiple voices were coming through on different channels, all hey at once, creating a cacophony of overlapping transmissions that shouldn't have been possible with the radio's channel selection. The voices were discussing various aspects of highway travel, but the details they mentioned were all wrong. One driver was complaining about diesel prices that were decades out of date, talking about filling up for under $1 a gallon at that new truck stop near Flagstaff. Another voice was discussing CB equipment that hadn't been manufactured since the early 1980s, referring to models and features that Mason recognized from his early days of trucking, but hadn't heard mentioned in years. This is Midnight Rider westbound on Route 191. Came another transmission, this one from a female voice with a slight southern accent. You boys need to be real careful around mile marker 52. Lost a good friend there about 6 months back, jackknifed his rig trying to avoid something in the road. Never did figure out what it was he was trying to miss. The transmission was followed by several responses from other drivers, all expressing condolences and sharing similar stories about dangerous spots along the highway. Mason found himself drawn into the conversations, despite the increasingly unsettling feeling that something wasn't right about these transmissions. The drivers' voices were discussing routes and truck stops with intimate knowledge, mentioning details about road conditions and local landmarks that only someone who had driven these highways for years would know. But they were also referencing events and places that didn't exist anymore, talking about truck stops that had been demolished and highways that had been rerouted decades ago. Breaker for that Peterbilt heading north past mile marker 50, came a new voice, and Mason's blood ran cold. The voice was describing his exact truck and location, but he hadn't transmitted his position to anyone. You got your ears on, driver? This is Iron Eagle, and I got some information you need to hear. Mason grabbed his mic immediately, his hands shaking slightly as he keyed the transmitter. This is Mason northbound in the Peterbilt. Go ahead, Iron Eagle. There was a long pause, filled with static that seemed to pulse with an almost rhythmic pattern, before Iron Eagle responded. Mason, you need to know something about the stretch you're driving through. Iron Eagle's voice came back, clearer than any CB transmission Mason had ever heard. This ain't just highways, son. This is where drivers come to rest when they can't find their way home. Every voice you're hearing tonight belongs to someone who died on this road, and they're all trying to warn you about what's coming. Mason felt his mouth go dry as he processed what Iron Eagle was telling him. "What do you mean, what's coming?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mile marker 52, just like Midnight Riders said," Iron Eagle responded. "That's where the trouble is. Something's been waiting there for a long time. Something that causes drivers to see things that ain't there and swerve into things that are. We've all lost friends at that spot, and we're still trying to prevent others from joining us." As if on cue, multiple voices began chiming in on different channels, all warning Mason about mile marker 52. They described a dark figure that would appear in the headlights, causing drivers to swerve violently to avoid what looked like a person in the road. But there was never anyone there, and the sudden maneuver would send trucks rolling or jackknifing into the desert. The voices spoke with the authority of experience, describing the phenomenon in detail and offering advice on how to survive the encounter. "When you see it, don't swerve," advised a voice that identified itself as Big Jim. "I know every instinct you got will tell you to avoid hitting what looks like a person, but trust me, there ain't nobody there. Keep your truck straight and true, and don't let whatever you see in those headlights make you panic. The thing feeds on fear," added another voice, this one calling itself Phantom Freight. "The more scared you get, the more real it appears. Some drivers say it looks like a woman in a white dress. Others see a man in work clothes. But it's always standing right in the center of your lane, always looking like it's about to be hit." Mason's hands were sweating as he gripped the steering wheel, watching his odometer count down the miles to the dreaded mile marker 52. The voices on the CB continued their warnings, sharing stories of drivers who had encountered the figure and describing the aftermath of accidents that had occurred at that exact spot. According to the ghostly truckers, the phenomenon had been happening for decades, claiming drivers at regular intervals and adding their voices to the spectral CB chatter that warned future travelers. "Remember, Mason," Iron Eagle's voice cut through the other transmissions. "We're all here because we didn't listen to the warnings. Don't let fear make you one of us." As Mason approached mile marker 52, his headlights illuminated something in the road ahead. It was exactly as the voices had described, a figure standing in the center of his lane, perfectly positioned to force him into an evasive maneuver. The figure appeared to be a middle-aged man in work clothes, standing perfectly still with his arms at his sides, facing the oncoming truck with an expression of calm resignation. Every instinct Mason possessed screamed at him to swerve, to avoid what his eyes told him was a solid, three-dimensional person about to be crushed under his wheels. The figure looked absolutely real, casting shadows in his headlights, and even appearing to have texture and detail in its clothing. But Mason remembered the warnings from the spectral truckers and forced himself to maintain his course, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. As his truck passed through the space where the figure stood, Mason felt a sudden drop in temperature and heard what sounded like a whisper right next to his ear. "Thank you for not stopping." In his rearview mirror, he could see nothing but empty highway behind him. The moment he passed mile marker 52, the CB radio fell completely silent. All the voices that had been chattering and warning him for the past hour simply vanished, leaving only static. Mason tried calling out on multiple channels, asking if anyone could hear him, but received no response. The radio worked perfectly fine for the rest of his trip, picking up normal trucker chatter as he approached populated areas. But he never heard from Desert Ghost, Iron Eagle, Midnight Rider, or any of the other spectral voices again. When Mason reached his destination in Salt Lake City the next morning, he decided to do some research about mile marker 52 on Route 191. What he found in old newspaper archives confirmed his worst fears. Over the past 40 years, more than 24 truckers had died in single-vehicle accidents at that exact location, all of them involving sudden swerving maneuvers that investigators could never explain. The accidents all followed the same pattern: experienced drivers with clean safety records suddenly losing control of their vehicles for no apparent reason. Mason also discovered something else that chilled him to the bone. In several of the accident reports, investigators had noted that the deceased driver's CB radios were found tuned to obscure channels and frequencies that weren't commonly used by truckers. In one case, from 1987, the investigating officer noted that the driver's radio was still transmitting a faint signal even after the truck's electrical system had been destroyed in the crash. Mason never drove Route 191 through that stretch of Arizona again. He requested route changes that added hundreds of miles to his trips, rather than risk another encounter with the spectral truckers who patrol that lonely highway. But sometimes, late at night when he's driving other desert highways, Mason turns his CB to those obscure channels and listens for voices that might be trying to warn other drivers about dangers ahead. He's never heard Iron Eagle or the others again, but he knows they're out there somewhere, broadcasting their warnings into the desert night, trying to save the living from joining their eternal convoy on the highways of the dead. Let's move to our fourth story. In March 2020, travel blogger and social media influencer Faith was documenting her cross-country road trip for her popular Instagram account, Wanderlust Faith, when she decided to take the scenic route through Nevada's Highway 50, famously known as the loneliest road in America. What started as content creation for her 50,000 followers would become an experience that she documented in her travel journal, but never shared online. An encounter with a place that, according to every map and GPS system, should not exist. Faith had been driving for 6 hours straight from Reno, pushing through the vast expanse of Nevada desert as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains. Her plan was to reach Ely by nightfall. But as darkness settled over Highway 50, she realized she had severely underestimated the distances involved. The fuel gauge on her rented Toyota Camry was approaching the quarter-tank mark, and according to her GPS, the next gas station was still over 80 miles away. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she hadn't seen another vehicle for over an hour. That's when she spotted the neon sign glowing in the distance. A bright pink and blue beacon cutting through the desert darkness like a mirage made real. As she got closer, she could make out the words Desert Rose Motel in cursive script, with an arrow pointing toward a cluster of low buildings set back from the highway. Below the main sign, a smaller neon sign blinked vacancy in cheerful red letters. Faith felt a wave of relief wash over her. She hadn't seen this motel mentioned on any travel websites or review platforms, but that wasn't unusual for remote areas of Nevada. She pulled into the gravel parking lot, her headlights sweeping across a scene that looked like it had been preserved in amber since the 1950s. The motel consisted of 12 individual units arranged in an L shape around a central courtyard, each door painted in pastel colors that had faded but somehow retained their charm. Classic cars from the Eisenhower era filled several parking spaces. A pristine 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, a mint-condition Ford Thunderbird, and what appeared to be a fully restored Cadillac Eldorado, all gleaming under the parking lot's vintage street lamps. The office was housed in a separate building at the front of the complex, its large windows glowing with warm yellow light. Through the glass, Faith could see wood-paneled walls lined with tourist brochures and a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a Norman Rockwell painting. A bell chimed pleasantly as she pushed through the front door, and she was immediately struck by the attention to detail in the decor. Everything from the atomic age furniture to the vintage Coca-Cola machine in the corner seemed authentically period-appropriate. Behind the desk stood a woman who appeared to be in her 40s, wearing a perfectly pressed floral dress and an apron that looked like it had been starched within an inch of its life. Her hair was styled in an elaborate bouffant that must have taken hours to achieve, and her makeup was applied with the precision of a professional portrait photographer. She looked up from a guest registry book, an actual physical ledger rather than a computer system, and smiled with genuine warmth. "Welcome to the Desert Rose Motel, honey," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Faith couldn't quite place. "I'm Mrs. Patterson, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. You look like you could use a good rest after driving through all that emptiness out there." Mrs. Patterson's manner of speaking had an old-fashioned quality to it, using phrases and inflections that reminded Faith of her grandmother's stories about life in small-town America decades ago. Faith explained that she needed a room for the night and asked about rates. Mrs. Patterson quoted a price of $12 for a single room, which seemed impossibly low even for a remote desert motel. When Faith mentioned that she only had credit cards, Mrs. Patterson smiled and said they preferred cash, but would be happy to trust her for payment in the morning. The whole interaction felt refreshingly genuine compared to the sterile efficiency of modern chain hotels. As Mrs. Patterson filled out the registration by hand, Faith noticed the guest registry contained dozens of entries, all written in various styles of cursive handwriting that seemed to span different decades. She caught glimpses of names and dates, some appearing to be from the 1960s and 70s, others more recent. What struck her as odd was that every single entry appeared to be written with fountain pens or other vintage writing instruments, and many of the signatures had an elaborate, formal quality that people rarely used anymore. Mrs. Patterson handed Faith a genuine brass key attached to a large plastic tag shaped like a cactus. "You're in room 7, dear. It's our nicest unit, with a view of the desert sunrise. The amenities might seem a bit old-fashioned compared to what you're used to, but I think you'll find everything you need for a comfortable stay." She gestured toward a rack of tourist brochures promoting attractions that Faith was fairly certain no longer existed: drive-in theaters, roadside dinosaur parks, and motor lodges with names like Chief Running Bear's Wigwam Village. Room 7 was exactly what Faith expected after seeing the office. A perfectly preserved time capsule from the mid-20th century. The furniture was authentic mid-century modern, from the boomerang-patterned formica table to the kidney-shaped mirror above the dresser. The bedspread featured an atomic age design in turquoise and orange, and the bathroom contained original pink and black tile work that would have cost a fortune to reproduce. Even the television was a genuine 1950s model with a circular screen and rabbit ear antennas. Faith spent the evening documenting everything in her travel journal, taking careful notes about the motel's incredible attention to historical accuracy. She tried to get Wi-Fi signal to upload photos to her Instagram account, but her phone showed no service at all, not even the emergency-only signal she usually found in remote areas. The complete digital blackout actually felt refreshing, giving her a chance to experience the place without the constant ping of notifications and the pressure to share everything immediately online. What made the experience truly surreal was the other guests she encountered. During her walk around the courtyard, she met a young couple who looked like they had stepped out of a 1950s magazine advertisement. The man wore perfectly pressed slacks and a cardigan sweater, while the woman had victory rolls in her hair and wore a circle skirt with saddle shoes. They were sitting on folding chairs outside their room, sharing a bottle of Coca-Cola and listening to what sounded like genuine 1950s radio programming on a vintage portable radio. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" the woman called out as Faith passed by. "We're the Hendersons, traveling from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City. Are you on vacation too, dear?" Her manner of speaking matched Mrs. Patterson's old-fashioned formality, and when Faith tried to make conversation about modern topics, the couple seemed genuinely confused by references to smartphones, social media, or contemporary events. Later that evening, Faith encountered several other guests who all seemed to share the same anachronistic quality. There was an elderly gentleman who claimed to be a traveling salesman, carrying a genuine leather sample case and wearing a suit that looked like it had been tailored in the Truman administration. A family with 3 children was playing with toys that appeared to be authentic vintage items rather than modern reproductions, and their car was a perfectly maintained 1959 Buick that showed no signs of restoration work. The most unsettling moment came around midnight, when Faith heard music drifting across the courtyard. The kind of big band orchestral arrangements that had been popular during World War II. Following the sound, she discovered that it was coming from the motel's small recreation room, where several guests were dancing to music played on an old Wurlitzer jukebox. Everyone was dressed in period-appropriate clothing and seemed to be having a wonderful time. But when Faith tried to join the gathering, she felt like she was watching a movie through thick glass. The other guests acknowledged her presence politely, but seemed unable to fully connect with her, as if she existed in a slightly different dimension. Faith spent a restless night in room 7, alternating between fascination with the motel's incredible authenticity and growing unease about the other guests' behavior. Every detail of the place was perfect. Too perfect. As if someone had invested millions of dollars in creating the most accurate historical recreation possible. But the guests themselves seemed genuinely unaware that they were living in the past, treating 1950s culture and technology as if it were completely current. The next morning, Faith woke to find fresh coffee and pastries waiting outside her door, along with a handwritten note from Mrs. Patterson thanking her for staying at the Desert Rose Motel. The breakfast items were packaged in vintage wax paper and tied with string, and the coffee came in a genuine ceramic thermos that probably belonged in a museum. When she tried to find Mrs. Patterson to pay for her room and return the key, the office was locked with a sign that read, "Gone fishing, back this afternoon." Faith decided to leave payment under the office door and began loading her car for the continuation of her journey. As she backed out of the parking space, she took one last look at the Desert Rose Motel in her rearview mirror, planning to capture some final photos once she reached a location with cell service. But when she glanced back after driving only a few hundred yards, the motel had completely vanished. The neon sign, the buildings, the vintage cars, and the other guests. Everything had disappeared, as if it had never existed at all. Confused and more than a little frightened, Faith made a U-turn and drove back to where the motel should have been. She found nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon, with no sign that any structures had ever stood there. The gravel parking lot was gone, replaced by undisturbed sand and sagebrush. There were no tire tracks, no foundation marks, no evidence that the Desert Rose Motel had ever been anything more than a hallucination. When Faith finally reached Eli and found cell service, she immediately began searching online for any reference to the Desert Rose Motel on Highway 50. She found nothing. No websites, no reviews, no historical records, no photographs. According to every digital map and satellite image she could access, there were no structures of any kind in the area where she had spent the night. Nevada tourism websites made no mention of the motel, and when she called the state's Historical Preservation Office, they had no record of any mid-century hospitality businesses operating in that stretch of desert. The only evidence Faith had of her experience was the brass key still in her pocket, the ceramic coffee thermos on her passenger seat, and the detailed notes she had written in her travel journal. But when she examined these items more closely in the daylight, she noticed something disturbing. The key was tarnished and worn, as if it had been used for decades, and the thermos had a patina of age that suggested it was genuinely vintage rather than a reproduction. Faith never posted about the Desert Rose Motel on her social media accounts, and she eventually stopped mentioning the experience to friends and family because no one believed her story. But she kept the brass key and the thermos, and sometimes, late at night when she's driving through remote areas, she finds herself looking for neon signs that promise rest and hospitality from a time that may never have existed at all. She's never found the Desert Rose Motel again. But she's also never stopped believing that somewhere on Highway 50, Mrs. Patterson is still waiting behind her reception desk, ready to welcome weary travelers into a world where the past refuses to stay buried. Let's move to our fifth story. On October 15th, 2017, California Highway Patrol Officer Blake was 3 months into his assignment to the Death Valley Patrol Sector when he encountered something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his job. Officer Blake had been specifically requested for the Death Valley assignment because of his reputation for thorough reporting and his ability to handle the unique challenges of policing one of the most remote and dangerous stretches of highway in the American West. What happened that night on Route 160 would become the most detailed and unsettling police report in the history of the Inyo County Sheriff's Department. Officer Blake was conducting his regular overnight patrol along the stretch of Route 160 that approaches Death Valley from the Nevada border, a desolate section of highway that sees minimal traffic during daylight hours and becomes virtually empty after sunset. The area was known among local law enforcement for its high number of single-vehicle accidents, equipment failures, and stranded motorists who underestimated the harsh conditions of the Mojave Desert. Blake had responded to dozens of calls in this area during his 3 months on the assignment, ranging from overheated vehicles to tragic cases of people who had wandered into the desert and never returned. At exactly 3:33 a.m., Blake was parked at his usual observation point near mile marker 78, monitoring radio traffic and completing paperwork from an earlier traffic stop, when he noticed a line of headlights approaching from the east. This wasn't unusual in itself. Occasionally, convoys of military vehicles or commercial trucks would travel through the area during the early morning hours to avoid the extreme daytime heat. But as the vehicles drew closer, Blake realized there was something fundamentally wrong with what he was seeing. The convoy consisted of approximately 12 vehicles, all traveling in perfect formation with precisely measured spacing between each one. Their headlights had an unusual quality. Instead of the bright white or yellow beams produced by modern vehicles, these lights had a warm, amber glow that reminded Blake of the sealed beam headlights used on cars from the 1940s and 1950s. The vehicles were maintaining a speed of exactly 45 miles per hour, which was oddly slow for the 70-mile-per-hour speed limit on that stretch of highway. As the convoy passed Blake's position, he got a clear look at the vehicles and felt his training and experience collide with something his rational mind couldn't process. The lead vehicle was a 1947 Packard sedan in pristine condition, followed by a series of cars that looked like they had rolled off showroom floors decades ago. A 1949 Mercury Coupe, a 1952 Buick Roadmaster, a 1954 Cadillac Eldorado, and several other vehicles that Blake recognized from his grandfather's old car magazines. Every vehicle was in perfect condition, with chrome that gleamed in the moonlight and paint jobs that showed no signs of age or wear. What made the sight even more unsettling was that Blake could clearly see the occupants of each vehicle. Every car contained what appeared to be a family unit, parents in the front seats, children in the back, all dressed in clothing that matched the era of their vehicles. The adults wore suits and dresses that looked like they had been pressed that morning, and the children were dressed in the kind of formal attire that families used for special occasions in the post-war era. None of the passengers appeared to be looking around or acknowledging their surroundings. They all stared straight ahead with expressions of calm determination, as if they were focused on reaching a destination that only they could see. Blake immediately activated his patrol vehicle's emergency lights and began following the convoy, intending to conduct a routine traffic stop to verify licenses and registration. But as he accelerated to catch up with the rear vehicle, something impossible happened. Despite maintaining what his speedometer showed as 75 miles per hour, he couldn't close the distance between his patrol car and the convoy. The vintage vehicles continued to travel at their steady 45 miles per hour pace, yet somehow they remained exactly the same distance ahead of him, no matter how fast he drove. After several minutes of this impossible pursuit, Blake activated his radio to report the situation to dispatch. Control, this is Unit 47 requesting backup for a traffic stop on Route 160 eastbound near mile marker 82. I'm following a convoy of approximately 12 vehicles, all vintage automobiles from the 1940s and 1950s, traveling at 45 miles per hour in a 70 miles per hour zone. Unable to close distance for unknown reasons. Request assistance and possible 1054 for mechanical inspection. The dispatcher's response crackled through the radio with confusion evident in her voice. Unit 47, please repeat your last transmission. Did you say vintage automobiles? When Blake confirmed his report, the dispatcher asked him to provide license plate numbers for the vehicles. Blake focused his spotlight on the rear vehicle in the convoy, a 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air, and felt his stomach drop as he read the license plate aloud. Control. Rear vehicle displays California license plate DJ4792. Plate appears to be vintage black and yellow design, not current format. There was a long pause before the dispatcher responded. And when she did, her voice had taken on a distinctly professional tone that Blake recognized as the way dispatchers spoke when they were consulting with supervisors. Unit 47, please hold your position and continue observation. We're running that plate number now. The wait seemed to stretch on forever. And during that time, Blake noticed that the convoy had begun to slow down even further. The vehicles were now traveling at approximately 30 miles per hour, and Blake could see that they were approaching the turnoff for Badwater Road, which led deeper into Death Valley toward some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in the park. Finally, the dispatcher's voice returned, and Blake could hear the confusion and concern in her transmission. Unit 47, license plate DJ4792 was issued to a 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air, registered to Robert and Helen Morrison of Bakersfield, California. However, our records show that this vehicle and its occupants were involved in a fatal accident on Route 160 on October 15, 1957, exactly 60 years ago to the day. The vehicle went off the road near mile marker 85 during a family vacation to Death Valley. All 4 occupants were killed. Blake felt the temperature inside his patrol car drop noticeably as he processed this information. He immediately requested that dispatch run additional license plates from the convoy, and over the next several minutes, a horrifying pattern emerged. Every single vehicle in the convoy had been involved in fatal accidents on or near Route 160, all of them occurring on October 15th in different years spanning from 1947 to 1965. The occupants had all been families traveling to Death Valley for vacations or sightseeing trips. And in every case, the vehicles had gone off the road in the same general area near mile marker 85. As Blake continued to follow the spectral convoy, he noticed that the surrounding landscape was beginning to change in ways that defied explanation. The familiar landmarks he used for navigation were shifting position, and the mile markers seemed to be counting backward rather than forward. His GPS unit was displaying coordinates that placed him in locations where he knew he couldn't possibly be. and his radio communications with dispatch were becoming increasingly filled with static. The convoy eventually turned onto Badwater Road, and Blake followed them deeper into Death Valley. Even though every instinct he possessed as both a police officer and a desert survival expert told him this was a dangerous mistake. The vintage vehicles continued their stately procession through the moonlit landscape, their occupants still staring straight ahead with those expressions of calm determination. Blake realized that they were heading toward Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America and one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. As they approached the Badwater parking area, the convoy came to a stop in perfect unison. Blake parked his patrol car at a safe distance and watched as the occupants of all 12 vehicles stepped out onto the salt flats. The families moved with synchronized precision, walking hand in hand toward the center of the basin, where the mineral deposits created an otherworldly landscape of crystalline formations. They appeared to be following a path that only they could see, moving deeper into the salt flats until they reached a point where the moonlight seemed to bend around them. Blake grabbed his high-powered flashlight and radio and began following the families on foot, calling out to them with standard police announcements about stopping for questioning. But his voice seemed to be swallowed by the desert air, producing no echo and apparently no response from the spectral travelers. As he got closer to the group, he could hear them speaking to each other in voices that carried clearly across the silent landscape. They were discussing their vacation plans, talking about the sights they wanted to see in Death Valley and the photographs they hoped to take. The conversations were filled with excitement and anticipation, with parents pointing out geological features to their children and sharing information from tourist brochures that had been printed decades ago. What made their discussions so unsettling was that they seemed completely unaware that they were dead, still planning activities and making decisions as if their interrupted vacations were continuing as scheduled. At exactly 4:44 a.m., the family stopped walking and turned to face east, toward the direction where the sun would rise in a few hours. They stood in perfect silence for several minutes, and Blake could see that many of them were holding hands or embracing, as if they were preparing for something significant. Then, without any visible signal or communication, they began walking back toward their vehicles with the same synchronized precision they had displayed earlier. Blake tried to intercept one of the families, the Morrisons from the 1953 Chevrolet. But when he reached the spot where they should have been standing, there was nothing but empty air. He could still see them clearly, could still hear their voices discussing the beautiful sunrise they were planning to watch. But they existed in a space that he couldn't physically enter. It was as if they were moving through the same landscape, but in a different dimension, one that occasionally intersected with his own reality, but remained fundamentally separate. The families returned to their vehicles and resumed their convoy formation. But instead of driving back toward Route 160, they began heading directly into the heart of Death Valley, along routes that didn't appear on any map Blake had ever seen. The vintage cars navigated terrain that should have been impassable for vehicles of their era, climbing rocky slopes and crossing salt flats that would have destroyed their tires and suspensions. Blake followed them as far as his patrol car could safely travel. But eventually, he had to stop and watch as the convoy disappeared into landscape that became increasingly surreal and impossible. The last thing Blake saw was the amber glow of their headlights cresting a ridge that his topographical maps insisted didn't exist. The lights lingered for a moment on the horizon, as if the families were taking one last look at the world they had left behind, before disappearing completely into whatever dimension they called home. Blake spent the rest of his shift filing a report that he knew no one would believe, documenting every detail of his encounter with photographic precision and police procedure. When his supervisor read the report the next day, Blake was immediately transferred to a different assignment and ordered to undergo psychological evaluation. But the evaluation found him to be completely stable and rational, with no signs of stress, hallucination, or mental illness. What Blake didn't know until years later was that he wasn't the first officer to encounter the October 15th convoy. Department records going back to the 1970s contained similar reports from other officers, all describing the same vintage vehicles, the same families, and the same impossible procession through Death Valley. Every report was filed on October 16th, documenting encounters that had occurred exactly at 3:33 a.m. on October 15th. And every officer who filed such a report was quietly transferred to different duties. Blake never patrolled Route 160 during the overnight hours again. But every October 15th, he drives out to mile marker 78 and parks at his old observation point. He's never seen the convoy again, but he's met other former patrol officers who have shared their own encounters with the spectral families. They've formed an unofficial support group, retired and active officers who understand that some things can't be explained by police procedure or rational investigation. And sometimes, late at night when the desert wind is howling across the salt flats, Blake swears he can still hear the distant sound of vintage engines and see the amber glow of headlights that belong to families who are still trying to complete vacations that were interrupted 60 years ago. Still searching for the perfect sunrise in a landscape where time has no meaning and the dead continue their endless journey toward destinations they will never reach. Let's move to our sixth story. In September 2019, veteran long-haul trucker Carlos Mendoza was hauling a load of automotive parts from Denver to Phoenix along U.S. Route 491, the highway formerly known as Route 666, before its ominous numerical designation was changed in 2003. Carlos had been driving professionally for over 18 years, covering millions of miles across America's highways. But he had always avoided this particular stretch of road whenever possible. The stories other truckers told about Route 491 were the kind that made even seasoned drivers change their routes. And Carlos had heard enough CB chatter over the years to know that some roads were better left to other people. But a lucrative contract and tight delivery deadline forced him onto the cursed highway that night. And what he encountered would haunt him for the rest of his driving career. Carlos was behind the wheel of his Freightliner Cascadia, pulling a 53-foot trailer loaded with transmission components, when he entered the New Mexico section of Route 491 around 11:45 p.m. The highway stretched ahead of him like a black ribbon cutting through the high desert landscape, with scattered juniper trees and towering red rock formations creating an alien landscape under the starlit sky. He had been monitoring Channel 19 on his CB radio, hoping to catch some trucker chatter to help pass the time, but the airwaves were eerily quiet. In 18 years of driving, Carlos had rarely encountered such complete radio silence on a major trucking route. The first sign that something was wrong came around mile marker 47, just as Carlos was settling into the rhythm of the long desert haul. His peripheral vision caught movement alongside the highway, dark shapes running parallel to his truck at what appeared to be impossible speeds. When he turned his head to get a better look, he saw what appeared to be a pack of large dogs keeping pace with his vehicle, which was traveling at 65 miles per hour. But these weren't ordinary dogs. They were massive creatures, easily the size of German shepherds or larger, with coal-black fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Carlos initially assumed he was seeing coyotes or perhaps feral dogs that had been startled by his truck's approach and were now running alongside the highway. It wasn't uncommon for wildlife to behave strangely around large vehicles, and the desert was home to numerous predator species that could appear threatening in low light conditions. But as he continued to observe the pack, Carlos realized that these animals were displaying behavior that defied every law of biology and physics he understood. The creatures were running at a sustained speed that matched his truck's 65 miles per hour pace, without any visible signs of effort or fatigue. Their gait was unnaturally smooth, with none of the bounding or irregular movement patterns typical of running dogs. They moved like shadows given form, flowing across the desert terrain with an almost liquid grace that made Carlos question whether he was really seeing animals at all. Most disturbing of all, when his headlights swept across them during turns in the road, the creatures cast no shadows, and their eyes reflected no light whatsoever. Just empty black voids where their faces should have been. Carlos grabbed his CB microphone and keyed channel 19, his voice shaking slightly as he transmitted. Breaker 19, this is Desert Freight eastbound on 491 near mile marker 48. Any drivers in the area, copy? I got some kind of wildlife situation here and could use some eyes on this. He waited for a response, scanning through several channels, but the radio remained completely silent except for the faint static that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heartbeat. The pack of creatures had grown larger since he first spotted them. What started as perhaps 6 or 7 animals had expanded to at least 12, and they were no longer content to simply run alongside his truck. The creatures began weaving back and forth across the highway, sometimes running directly in front of his vehicle before veering away at the last possible moment. Carlos found himself constantly adjusting his speed and position to avoid what appeared to be inevitable collisions. But the creatures seemed to anticipate his every move with supernatural precision. As the pursuit continued, Carlos noticed that the creatures were exhibiting behavior that no earthly animal would display. They began leaping over his truck's cab, their bodies passing directly through the beam of his headlights without casting any shadows on the road surface. When he looked in his side mirrors, he could see them running alongside his trailer, but their reflection didn't appear in the mirror glass. It was as if he was being stalked by living shadows that existed in the physical world, but followed none of its rules. The most terrifying moment came when one of the creatures ran directly at the driver's side of his cab and appeared to pass straight through the door and into the truck. Carlos felt a sudden drop in temperature and heard what sounded like heavy breathing right next to his ear. But when he turned his head, there was nothing there. The creature had somehow entered his cab without opening any doors or windows, and he could sense its presence even though he couldn't see it. The breathing sound continued for several minutes, accompanied by the distinct odor of sulfur and decay. Carlos tried using his cell phone to call for help, but the device showed no signal despite being in an area where he normally had good coverage. More disturbing still, when he tried to use the phone's flashlight to illuminate the cab interior, the light seemed to be absorbed by something invisible, creating pockets of absolute darkness that moved independently around the truck's cabin. He could hear the creature moving around behind him, its claws clicking against the metal floor of the cab. But every time he turned to look, there was nothing there. The pack outside his truck had grown even larger, and Carlos estimated there were now at least 20 of the shadow creatures running with him. They had formed a perfect escort formation, with animals on both sides of his truck and several more running directly ahead of his vehicle. The creatures in front would occasionally turn their heads back toward Carlos, and he could see that where their faces should have been, there were only empty spaces that seemed to pull light into themselves like miniature black holes. As Carlos approached mile marker 55, the creatures began exhibiting new behavior that pushed his terror to new heights. They started howling, not the normal vocalizations of dogs or wolves, but sounds that seemed to come from something that had never been alive at all. The howling was a mixture of mechanical grinding, electronic feedback, and what sounded like human screams played backward at high speed. The sounds were so loud that they drowned out his truck's engine noise and made the cab windows vibrate with their intensity. The howling seemed to be having an effect on his truck's mechanical systems. His engine began running rough, with the RPM gauge fluctuating wildly despite his maintaining steady pressure on the accelerator. The electrical systems were malfunctioning as well. His headlights dimmed and brightened in patterns that matched the creature's howling, and his CB radio began emitting bursts of static that almost sounded like voices speaking in an unknown language. Then, without warning, the creature that had somehow entered his cab made itself visible. Carlos saw it in his peripheral vision, a massive dog-like form sitting in his passenger seat, but composed entirely of what appeared to be living darkness. The creature had glowing red eyes that pulsed in time with Carlos's heartbeat, and when it opened its mouth, he could see rows of teeth that looked like shards of broken glass. The creature's presence filled the cab with an overwhelming sense of malevolence and ancient hunger. "You're on the Devil's Highway now," a voice whispered directly into Carlos's mind, though the creature's mouth hadn't moved. "You're in our territory, and you've been chosen to join the pack." The voice was accompanied by images that flooded Carlos's consciousness. Visions of other drivers who had encountered the demon dogs over the years, some of whom had been found dead in their cabs with no apparent cause. Others who had simply vanished along with their vehicles, leaving only skid marks and the lingering scent of sulfur. Carlos began praying aloud, reciting every prayer he could remember from his childhood, while gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. As he prayed, the creature in his passenger seat began to writhe and distort, as if the words were causing it physical pain. The pack running alongside his truck started falling back, their howling taking on notes of frustration and rage rather than hunting calls. The breakthrough came when Carlos remembered the rosary his grandmother had given him, which hung from his rearview mirror. As he reached for it while continuing to pray, the creature in his passenger seat let out a shriek that sounded like metal being torn apart and began to dissolve like smoke. The pack outside his truck scattered in all directions, disappearing into the desert as if they had never existed at all. Carlos's truck systems immediately returned to normal. His headlights brightened to their full intensity, and his CB radio crackled back to life with normal trucker chatter. He grabbed his microphone with shaking hands and transmitted a general call for any drivers in the area, and was relieved to hear several responses from truckers who were wondering where he had disappeared to for the past hour. According to their reports, his truck had been visible on the highway, but he hadn't responded to multiple radio calls during the time he was being pursued by the pack. When Carlos reached Phoenix the next morning, he filed a report with his dispatch office and considered calling the police, but ultimately decided that no one would believe his account of what had happened on Route 491. Instead, he began researching the history of the highway and discovered that reports of encounters with demonic black dogs dated back to the road's original construction in the 1920s. Native American tribes in the area had legends about shadow creatures that hunted travelers, and several truckers had reported similar experiences over the decades, though most were reluctant to speak about them publicly. Carlos learned that Route 491 had originally been designated as Route 666, earning it the nickname the Devil's Highway. The numerical designation was changed in 2003 partly due to the highway's reputation for unusual accidents and supernatural encounters. But changing the number hadn't changed the nature of whatever entities called that stretch of road their hunting ground. According to online forums and unofficial trucker networks, the demon dog pack was still active, targeting drivers who traveled the highway alone during the overnight hours. The most disturbing information Carlos found came from accident reports and missing person cases along Route 491. Over the past 50 years, dozens of drivers had been found dead in their vehicles, with no apparent cause of death. Their trucks undamaged, but filled with the overwhelming odor of sulfur. Other drivers had simply vanished. Their vehicles found abandoned on the roadside, with the engine still running and no sign of what had happened to the occupants. Carlos never drove Route 491 again, despite the fact that avoiding it added hundreds of miles to certain runs and cost him thousands of dollars in lost efficiency over the years. He also carried blessed religious items in his truck from that point forward and made sure to travel in convoy with other trucks, whenever possible during overnight hours. But sometimes, late at night when he's driving through other remote areas, Carlos hears distant howling carried on the desert wind and sees dark shapes moving just beyond the reach of his headlights, reminding him that some roads are patrolled by things that were never alive and have been hunting travelers since long before the first highway was ever built. Let's move to our seventh story. On the night of July 3rd, 2021, Interstate 10 near Blythe, California became the setting for one of the most disturbing 911 calls ever recorded by the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. The incident began when multiple motorists reported seeing a naked woman running at impossible speeds through the desert alongside the highway, exhibiting behavior that suggested either severe mental breakdown or something far more sinister. What made this case particularly haunting was that the entire encounter was captured in real time through a 911 call that lasted over 18 minutes, providing a terrifying audio record of events that investigators still cannot fully explain. The first call came in at 2:47 a.m. from a truck driver named Michael Torres, who was hauling produce from Phoenix to Los Angeles along the eastbound lanes of Interstate 10. Michael had been driving professionally for 12 years and had seen his share of strange situations on America's highways. But nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed in the remote desert stretch between Blythe and Desert Center. His voice was steady but clearly shaken as he reported the initial sighting to the 911 dispatcher. "911, what's your emergency?" came the professional voice of dispatcher Sarah Chen, who had been working the overnight shift at the Riverside County Communications Center for over 5 years. She was accustomed to handling calls about everything from vehicle accidents to wildlife encounters. But the report she was about to receive would become the most unsettling case of her career. "Ma'am, this is going to sound crazy, but I'm eastbound on I-10 near mile marker 47, and there's a naked woman running alongside the highway," Michael reported, his voice carrying the confusion and concern of someone trying to process an impossible situation. "She's been keeping pace with my truck for about 2 miles now, and I'm doing 65 miles per hour. I don't know how that's possible, but she's definitely human, and she's definitely keeping up." Dispatcher Chen immediately began following protocol for reports of pedestrians on the highway, requesting Michael's exact location and asking if the woman appeared to be in distress or need of medical attention. But as Michael continued his description, it became clear that this was unlike any routine highway emergency the dispatch center had ever handled. "She's not just running, ma'am. She's moving like nothing I've ever seen. Her feet aren't touching the ground the way they should, and she's not showing any signs of getting tired. I've been watching her for 10 minutes now, and she hasn't slowed down or changed her pace at all. And ma'am, there's something wrong with her face. Even in my headlights, I can see that something is very wrong with her face." Chen dispatched units to the area while keeping Michael on the line, asking him to continue providing updates about the woman's location and behavior. As the conversation continued, more details emerged that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of what was happening on that isolated stretch of highway. Michael reported that the woman appeared to be completely naked and covered in what looked like dirt or mud. giving her skin a mottled, unnatural appearance in his truck's headlights. "She keeps looking at me," Michael continued, his voice becoming more strained with each update. "Every few seconds she turns her head toward my cab, and ma'am, I'm telling you there's something seriously wrong." Her mouth is hanging open like she's trying to say something, but I can see that her tongue is... Jesus, I don't even know how to describe it. It looks like it's been torn out or cut off, and there's this black stuff coming out of her mouth. The situation escalated when Michael reported that other vehicles on the highway were beginning to encounter the running woman. A family in an SUV had pulled over about a mile ahead, apparently after the woman had approached their vehicle and attempted to gain entry. Chen immediately dispatched additional units and requested medical personnel, suspecting they were dealing with someone experiencing a severe psychotic episode or drug-induced delirium. The family ahead just got back in their car and they're driving off real fast, Michael reported. The woman tried to get in their vehicle, and now she's running after them. "Ma'am, she just jumped onto the back of their SUV. I'm watching her right now. She's on the rear of their vehicle, holding on somehow while they're doing at least 70 miles per hour. Chen's training had prepared her for many emergence scenarios, but nothing in her experience matched what Michael was describing. She contacted her supervisor while maintaining the connection with Michael, and additional dispatchers were brought into the call to coordinate the growing emergency response. Highway patrol units were converging on the area from multiple directions, and medical helicopters were being placed on standby. The family in the SUV managed to shake off their pursuer when they took the exit for Desert Center, but the naked woman immediately returned her attention to Michael's truck. According to his increasingly frantic reports, she had somehow positioned herself directly in front of his vehicle and was running backward while maintaining eye contact with him through the windshield. The image he described was nightmarish. A dirt-covered woman with a mutilated mouth running at highway speeds while staring into his cab with an expression of desperate hunger. "She's trying to communicate something," Michael reported, his voice now barely above a whisper. "She keeps pointing at her mouth and then pointing at me, like she wants something from me. And ma'am, I just realized something that's making me sick to my stomach. She's not breathing. I can see her chest and it's not moving at all. Whatever this thing is, it's not breathing." Highway Patrol Officer Janet Rodriguez was the first unit to arrive in the area, approaching from the westbound lanes with her emergency lights activated. She could see Michael's truck in the distance and immediately spotted the figure running alongside it. But what she observed defied every assumption she had made about the nature of the call. In her radio report to dispatch, Officer Rodriguez confirmed that there was indeed a naked woman running at highway speeds. But her description added new layers of impossibility to an already inexplicable situation. "Control, I have visual on the subject. Female appears to be mid-20s, completely unclothed, covered in what looks like dirt or dried mud. She's maintaining pace with the reporting party's vehicle at approximately 65 miles per hour. I am unable to determine how this is physically possible. The subject's movement appears unnatural. No visible signs of exertion, and her gait does not match normal running mechanics." As Officer Rodriguez attempted to position her patrol vehicle to intercept the running woman, she witnessed behavior that challenged everything she understood about human physiology and physics. The woman suddenly changed direction and began running directly toward Rodriguez's patrol car, covering the distance between the highway lanes in a matter of seconds. When Rodriguez activated her spotlight to get a better look, the woman stopped running and stood perfectly still in the beam of light. "Control, I have the subject illuminated and stationary approximately 50 yards from my position. Subject appears to be staring directly at my vehicle." I can confirm previous reports about facial injuries. The subject's mouth appears to have been severely damaged, and there is dark material visible around the oral cavity. Rodriguez's voice carried the professional calm of a trained officer, but those listening could detect the underlying tension of someone confronting something beyond normal experience. The standoff lasted for nearly 3 minutes, with the woman remaining motionless under Rodriguez's spotlight, while additional patrol units arrived on scene. During this time, Michael continued to provide commentary from his truck, which he had pulled over about a quarter-mile away. According to his account, the woman's attention seemed entirely focused on Officer Rodriguez's patrol car, and her posture suggested she was preparing to attack. "She's crouching down like an animal," Michael reported through the 911 connection. "Ma'am, she's getting ready to jump or run or something. Officer Rodriguez needs to get out of there right now." Before anyone could respond to Michael's warning, the woman launched herself toward Rodriguez's patrol car with a speed and trajectory that defied human capability. Officer Rodriguez reported that the subject covered the 50-yard distance in what felt like less than 2 seconds, landing on the hood of her patrol car with an impact that cracked the windshield through the damaged glass. Rodriguez got her first clear look at the woman's face and immediately understood why other witnesses had been so disturbed by her appearance. "Control, subject is on my vehicle. I can confirm severe facial mutilation. The tongue appears to have been removed, and the oral cavity contains what looks like dried blood or some other dark substance. Subject is attempting to bite through my windshield. Requesting immediate backup and medical response." Rodriguez's voice remained steady despite the impossibility of what she was experiencing. The woman began clawing at the windshield with fingernails that had been worn down to bloody stubs, leaving streaks of mud and what appeared to be dried blood on the glass. Her movements were frenzied but purposeful, as if she was trying to reach something specific inside the patrol car. Rodriguez noticed that despite the woman's violent activity, she was making no sounds at all. No screams, no vocalizations, not even the sound of heavy breathing that would be expected from such intense physical exertion. Additional patrol units arrived and attempted to surround the woman, but she displayed an awareness of their movements that seemed almost supernatural. Every time officers approached her position, she would leap from vehicle to vehicle with impossible agility, always staying just out of reach while continuing her attempts to break into the patrol cars. The officers found themselves in the surreal position of chasing a naked, apparently mute woman who could jump 15 feet between moving vehicles without losing her balance. The situation reached its climax when Officer Rodriguez made the decision to exit her patrol car and attempt to apprehend the subject using non-lethal force. As she opened her door, the woman immediately stopped her frenzied activity and turned to face the officer with what Rodriguez later described as an expression of profound hunger. The two stood facing each other for several seconds, and Rodriguez noted that the woman's eyes reflected her flashlight beam like an animal's eyes, glowing with an unnatural silver light. Subject's eyes are exhibiting retroreflective properties consistent with nocturnal predators, Rodriguez reported. This is not normal human physiology. Requesting guidance on how to proceed. Her training had not prepared her for a situation where standard arrest procedures might not apply to a subject whose basic biology appeared to be fundamentally different from normal humans. The woman suddenly opened her mouth, revealing the full extent of the damage that had been done to her oral cavity. Rodriguez could see that not only had the tongue been removed, but the entire interior of the mouth appeared to have been scraped clean, leaving only raw, dark tissue that glistened in the flashlight beam. But what horrified Rodriguez most was that despite the obvious severity of the injuries, there was no bleeding. The wounds appeared to have been cauterized or dried, as if they were very old. Before Rodriguez could react, The woman turned and ran directly into the desert, moving away from the highway at the same impossible speed she had displayed earlier. Within seconds, she had disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of the officers' lights, leaving behind only the damaged patrol car and the lingering scent of decay and dried earth. Despite immediate efforts to track her using helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, no trace of the woman was ever found. The 911 call ended with Michael Torres reporting that the woman had vanished completely and that the highway had returned to normal. The entire incident had lasted exactly 18 minutes and 43 seconds. But the effects on those involved would last much longer. Officer Rodriguez required medical attention for stress-related symptoms, and Michael Torres took several weeks off from driving to recover from the psychological trauma of the encounter. Investigation into the incident revealed no missing person reports that matched the description of the naked woman, and no evidence was found in the desert despite extensive searches using both ground teams and aerial surveillance. The damaged patrol car was analyzed by forensic specialists, but the material left on the windshield consisted only of common desert dirt and what appeared to be very old, desiccated organic matter that could not be identified. The case remains officially open, but inactive in the files of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. The 911 recording is used for training purposes, though it has been edited to remove some of the more disturbing audio elements. Officer Rodriguez eventually returned to active duty, but requested transfer to urban patrol areas, and Michael Torres changed his route to avoid that section of Interstate 10. Local Native American tribes in the area were consulted during the investigation, and several tribal elders mentioned legends about desert spirits that took the form of damaged humans to lure travelers away from safe paths. According to these stories, such entities were the remnants of people who had died horrible deaths in the desert and were condemned to wander eternally, seeking to share their suffering with the living. Whether the naked runner was such an entity or simply a disturbed individual with extraordinary physical capabilities remains unknown. But drivers on that stretch of Interstate 10 continue to report occasional sightings of a mud-covered figure running alongside the highway in the early morning hours, always just beyond the reach of headlights and always searching for something that can never be found. Let's move to our 8th story. In the early morning hours of November 7th, 2022, wildlife photographer Rebecca Chen was setting up her equipment for a sunrise shoot along a remote spur road off U.S. Highway 95, about 40 miles northeast of Beatty, Nevada. Rebecca had been documenting desert ecosystems for National Geographic for over 8 years, and this particular location had been recommended by a local ranger who claimed it offered some of the most pristine examples of Mojave Desert flora in the region. What Rebecca discovered that morning would force her to abandon not just her photography session, but her entire understanding of what it meant to be alone in the wilderness. Rebecca had arrived at the location around 4:30 a.m., driving her modified Ford Expedition along a barely visible dirt track that wound through scattered Joshua trees and limestone outcroppings. The area was completely isolated, with the nearest human habitation being a defunct mining operation more than 20 miles away. She had chosen this particular spot specifically because of its isolation. Desert wildlife photography required patience and solitude, and the presence of even distant human activity could disrupt the natural behaviors she was trying to capture. As she was setting up her telephoto equipment and establishing a concealed observation blind, Rebecca noticed something unusual in the pre-dawn darkness. About 200 yards from her position, she could see what appeared to be the glow of a single light source, moving slowly and methodically across the desert floor. The light was too steady and focused to be a vehicle's headlight, and too bright to be a standard flashlight. It had the concentrated intensity of a high-powered work lamp, the kind used for construction or excavation projects, Rebecca's first assumption was that she had accidentally chosen a location near some kind of legitimate work site, perhaps geological survey work or archaeological excavation that was being conducted during the cooler overnight hours. Nevada's desert was home to numerous scientific projects and mining surveys, and it wasn't uncommon for such operations to work around the clock to avoid the extreme daytime temperatures. She decided to investigate, both out of professional curiosity and to determine if she needed to relocate her photography session to avoid disturbing ongoing work. As she approached the light source, carrying her camera equipment and a high-powered LED flashlight, Rebecca could make out more details of what was happening in that isolated patch of desert. A single person was working with methodical precision, using what appeared to be a combination of hand tools and a small mechanical excavator to dig what looked like a perfectly rectangular pit in the hard desert soil. The dimensions were precise. Approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and based on the height of the dirt pile beside it, at least 6 feet deep. The measurements were so exact that Rebecca realized she was looking at someone digging what could only be described as a grave. The person doing the digging was a middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, wearing work clothes that looked like they had been purchased specifically for this task. His jeans, work shirt, and boots all appeared to be brand new, without the worn patches and stains that would be expected from someone who regularly performed manual labor. He worked with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world, methodically removing dirt and stone from the pit while occasionally stopping to check the dimensions with a measuring tape. What made the scene particularly unsettling was the man's complete lack of surprise or concern when he noticed Rebecca approaching. He looked up from his work, made direct eye contact with her across the desert darkness, and simply nodded in acknowledgement before returning to his excavation. There was no startled reaction, no defensive posture, no attempt to explain what he was doing or why he was doing it in such a remote location. He acted as if digging a perfect grave in the middle of nowhere at 5 a.m. was the most natural thing in the world. Rebecca called out a greeting, her voice carrying clearly across the still desert air. "Good morning. I'm sorry to disturb you. I'm here doing some wildlife photography, and I saw your light. Is this some kind of archaeological dig?" The man stopped working and looked at her again, this time with what she later described as a patient, almost paternal expression. He set down his shovel and walked to the edge of the pit, wiping his hands on a clean towel that he pulled from his back pocket. "Not archaeological, no," he replied in a voice that was calm and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than his nocturnal excavation project. "Just getting ready for someone who's going to need this soon." He gestured toward the perfectly rectangular hole with obvious pride in his craftsmanship. "It's important to be prepared, you know. Desert ground is hard to work with, especially when you're in a hurry." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as the implications of his words began to sink in. "Getting ready for someone? Are you with a funeral home or cemetery service?" The man smiled at her question, but it wasn't the kind of smile that provided any comfort. It was the smile of someone who knew something that she didn't. Someone who was enjoying having information that would disturb her if she fully understood it. "Something like that," he said, returning to his work with the same methodical precision. "Everyone needs a final resting place, and it's better to have it ready ahead of time. Saves a lot of trouble later." As he continued digging, Rebecca noticed that he was humming softly to himself, a tune that sounded like a hymn or funeral dirge, though she couldn't identify the specific melody. Rebecca tried to engage him in further conversation, asking about who had hired him for this work and whether he had the proper permits for excavation in what she assumed was public land. But the man seemed to have lost interest in talking, focusing entirely on his digging with an intensity that suggested He was working against some kind of deadline. The only responses she could get were non-committal hums and the occasional mm-hmm when she asked direct questions. As the sky began to lighten with the approaching sunrise, Rebecca could see more details of the man's work site. Beside the pit, he had arranged a collection of tools with the precision of a surgeon's instrument tray. There were shovels of different sizes, a pickaxe, a hand tamper for compacting soil, and several measuring devices. Everything was clean and well maintained, suggesting this wasn't his first excavation project. Most disturbing of all, she noticed a wooden marker stake lying beside the tool collection, with something carved into its surface that she couldn't read from her distance. The man's digging technique was remarkably efficient, and Rebecca realized that despite the hard desert soil, he was making steady progress. The pit was now clearly deeper than 6 feet, and he showed no signs of fatigue despite having obviously been working for hours before she arrived. His movements remained precise and rhythmic, as if he was following some kind of internal metronome that kept him working at the optimal pace. Rebecca decided to take photographs of the scene, partly for documentation and partly because she was beginning to feel genuinely concerned about what she was witnessing. As she raised her camera and began focusing the telephoto lens, the man suddenly stopped digging and looked directly at her. Even from 200 yards away, she could see that his expression had changed from patient concentration to something that looked almost predatory. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert despite the distance. Some things aren't meant to be recorded. Some preparations need to be kept private. He set down his shovel and began walking toward her with the same unhurried pace that characterized his digging. Rebecca felt every instinct she possessed telling her to leave the area immediately. She began backing toward her vehicle while keeping the man in sight, but he continued his steady approach with what looked like grim determination. "You know," he called out conversationally, "I was wondering who this pit was for. Been getting the feeling for weeks now that I needed to dig it, but I wasn't sure who was going to need it. But now that you're here, everything makes perfect sense." Rebecca abandoned any pretense of professional curiosity and ran for her Ford Expedition, throwing her camera equipment into the back seat and starting the engine with hands that were shaking so badly she could barely turn the key. As she backed up the dirt track as fast as she safely could, she could see the man, in her rearview mirror, still walking toward her vehicle with that same patient, unhurried pace, as if he knew she wouldn't be able to escape. The dirt track leading back to Highway 95 was narrow and winding, forcing Rebecca to drive slowly despite her urgent desire to put distance between herself and the mysterious excavator. Several times she had to stop completely to navigate around large rocks or deep ruts, and each time she looked in her mirrors, she expected to see the man following her on foot. But the desert behind her remained empty, with only her own dust cloud marking her passage through the landscape. When Rebecca finally reached Highway 95 and could drive at normal speeds, she immediately called the Nye County Sheriff's Department to report what she had witnessed. The dispatcher took her report seriously, particularly when she mentioned the possibility that someone was digging unauthorized graves on public land. 2 deputies were dispatched to investigate, and Rebecca agreed to meet them at the turnoff to guide them to the location. When the search party returned to the site 3 hours later, they found absolutely nothing. The area where Rebecca had seen the man digging showed no signs of recent excavation. There were no tools, no pit, no piles of disturbed earth, and no tire tracks or footprints other than those left by Rebecca's own boots. The deputies conducted a thorough search of the surrounding area using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar equipment, but found no evidence that anyone had been digging in that location. Most unsettling of all, When the deputies used GPS coordinates to mark the exact location where Rebecca insisted she had seen the excavation, they discovered that according to county records, that precise spot had been the site of 3 unexplained disappearances over the past 15 years. Hikers, photographers, and off-road enthusiasts had vanished without a trace in that area. Their vehicles found abandoned, but with no indication of what had happened to the occupants. Rebecca returned to the site one more time, accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies and a county surveyor. In daylight, with multiple witnesses present, the location appeared completely normal. Just another patch of Mojave Desert with no signs of human activity. But as they were preparing to leave, the surveyor made a discovery that changed everything. Using ground-penetrating radar, he detected a rectangular void beneath the surface, approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 6 feet deep, located at the exact spot where Rebecca had seen the man digging. When questioned about whether the void could be a natural geological formation, the surveyor was adamant that the dimensions were too precise and the shape too regular to be anything other than human excavation. But when the sheriff's department obtained authorization to excavate the site, they found only undisturbed desert soil. The radar anomaly had disappeared as mysteriously as it had appeared, leaving investigators with no physical evidence to support Rebecca's account. Rebecca never returned to that area of Nevada for her photography work. She requested reassignment to different ecosystems and eventually left desert wildlife photography entirely, citing personal reasons for her career change. But she kept detailed notes of her encounter, including photographs of the general location and GPS coordinates that she checked obsessively for months afterward. The most disturbing aspect of Rebecca's experience came 6 months later, when she learned about the death of another wildlife photographer who had been working in the same general area of Nevada. The photographer had been found dead in his tent with no apparent cause, his equipment undisturbed, and no signs of foul play. According to the investigation report, his GPS unit showed that he had been camping within half a mile of the coordinates where Rebecca had encountered the mysterious excavator. Local desert guides and longtime Nevada residents who were quietly consulted about the incident shared stories of similar encounters dating back decades. According to these unofficial accounts, the pit digger was a recurring phenomenon in certain areas of the Mojave, always appearing when someone was going to die in that location, always preparing graves with supernatural precision for victims who hadn't yet become victims. The story suggested that seeing the digger was both a warning and a death sentence, and that the only way to survive such an encounter was to leave the area immediately and never return. Rebecca eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest, where she now specializes in forest ecology photography. But she has never forgotten the patient, methodical way the man had dug that perfect grave, or the calm certainty in his voice when he suggested that the pit was meant for her. Sometimes, late at night when she's alone in the forest, she hears the distant sound of digging and wonders if the man is still out there in the Nevada desert, preparing graves for people who don't yet know they're going to need them, working with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and the certainty of someone who knows exactly what's coming. Let's move to our 9th story. In August 2020, pharmaceutical sales representative David Chen was driving his company vehicle along U.S. Highway 50 in Nevada, making the grueling journey from Reno to Salt Lake City to meet with medical facilities along what locals call the loneliest road in America. David had made this drive dozens of times over his 5-year career, and he prided himself on his meticulous planning. He knew every gas station, every rest stop, and every mile marker along the 400-mile route. But what happened during his overnight drive would challenge everything he thought he knew about the road he traveled so regularly, and force him to question whether the familiar landmarks he depended on were as real as he had always believed. David had left Reno at 11 p.m., planning to drive straight through the night to reach Salt Lake City by dawn. His Honda Accord was in perfect mechanical condition, he had a full tank of gas, and his GPS showed clear weather all along his route. The first few hours of the drive proceeded normally, with David maintaining his usual pace and listening to podcasts to help pass the time through the endless stretches of Nevada desert. He was an experienced road warrior who had learned to appreciate the stark beauty of the high desert landscape. Even during the lonely overnight hours when he might not see another vehicle for 50 miles at a stretch. The trouble began around 2:30 a.m., approximately 180 miles east of Reno, when David's fuel gauge began approaching the quarter-tank mark earlier than he had expected. According to his calculations and previous experience, he should have been able to reach the town of Ely before needing to refuel, but his consumption rate was running higher than normal. He wasn't particularly concerned. Highway 50 had several 24-hour truck stops and gas stations specifically positioned to serve long-distance travelers who needed fuel during overnight hours. That's when David spotted the Sinclair station appearing out of the darkness ahead. Its distinctive green dinosaur logo illuminated by bright fluorescent lights that cut through the desert night like a beacon. The station looked exactly like the classic Sinclair outlets that had served American highways since the 1960s, complete with vintage-style pumps and a small convenience store that glowed with warm yellow light. David felt a sense of relief and nostalgia as he pulled into the station. There was something comforting about finding one of the old-school service stations that reminded him of childhood road trips with his parents. As David pulled up to the pumps, he noticed several details that struck him as charmingly retro. The gas pumps were the old-fashioned type with analog dials and mechanical counters, the kind that required an attendant to operate and made satisfying clicking sounds as they dispensed fuel. The prices displayed on the pump faces were remarkably low. Regular unleaded was listed at $1.47 per gallon, which seemed impossible even for rural Nevada in 2020. David assumed the station simply hadn't updated their pump displays in years, a common practice in remote areas where modernization was expensive and customers were scarce. A uniformed attendant emerged from the station office almost immediately after David stopped his vehicle. The man appeared to be in his 40s, wearing perfectly pressed Sinclair coveralls with his name Frank embroidered on a patch over the left breast pocket. His appearance was impeccable. His uniform looked like it had been freshly laundered and starched. His hair was neatly combed with what appeared to be genuine pomade, and his demeanor was professional and courteous in a way that reminded David of service station attendants from old movies. "Good evening, sir," Frank said with a genuine smile as he approached David's vehicle. "Fill her up with regular? Check your oil and water while I'm at it?" His manner of speaking had an old-fashioned formality that seemed both authentic and slightly anachronistic, as if he had learned customer service techniques from training materials that were decades out of date. David found the interaction refreshing compared to the impersonal self-service stations that dominated modern highways. While Frank filled David's tank, David went inside the convenience store to use the restroom and purchase snacks for the remainder of his journey. The interior of the store was a perfect time capsule of mid-20th century American commerce. The shelves were stocked with brands and products that David recognized from his childhood but hadn't seen in years. Glass bottles of Coca-Cola, candy bars with vintage packaging, and snack foods in wrapper designs that had been discontinued decades ago. The cash register was a genuine mechanical model that required the clerk to manually enter prices and calculate tax. Behind the counter stood a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a floral dress and apron that looked like they belonged in a 1950s advertisement. Her hair was styled in perfect victory rolls, and her makeup was applied with a precision of someone who had spent considerable time in front of a mirror. She greeted David with the same old-fashioned courtesy that Frank had displayed, using phrases like, "How may I help you, dear?" and "Will that be all?" "For you tonight, hon?" That suggested she had been trained in customer service techniques from a different era. "That'll be $4.73 for the gas and $2.15 for your snacks," she said, as she rang up David's purchases on the mechanical register. The total seemed impossibly low, even accounting for the rural location and the vintage pricing displayed on the pumps. David handed her his credit card, but the woman looked at it with confusion, as if she had never seen such a payment method before. "Oh, honey, we don't have one of those electronic machines," she said apologetically. "Cash only, I'm afraid. There's an ATM right outside if you need to get some money." David was surprised, but not particularly concerned. Many remote gas stations operated as cash-only businesses to avoid credit card processing fees. He went outside to use the ATM, which turned out to be one of the old-style machines that dispensed $20 bills with mechanical precision and printed receipts on paper that felt thick and substantial compared to modern thermal paper. While David was getting cash from the ATM, Frank finished fueling his vehicle and cleaned his windshield with the kind of thoroughness that hadn't been standard at gas stations for decades. He used real glass cleaner and paper towels instead of the cheap squeegees and dirty water that most stations provided. And he took genuine pride in ensuring that David's windshield was spotless. When David returned with cash to pay for his purchases, Frank presented him with a handwritten receipt that included a detailed breakdown of services provided. "You drive careful now, Mr. Chen," Frank said as he handed David his receipt and change. "Road gets mighty lonely between here and Salt Lake, and you never know what you might encounter out there in the dark." His warning seemed oddly specific and personal, as if he knew something about David's journey that he shouldn't have known. David hadn't mentioned his destination or provided any personal information beyond what was necessary for the transaction. As David prepared to leave the station, he decided to ask Frank about the route ahead and the location of other 24-hour services between his current position and Salt Lake City. Frank provided detailed directions and recommendations, mentioning landmarks and businesses that David was familiar with from previous trips. But some of the information didn't quite match David's experience. Frank referenced a truck stop that David was fairly certain had been closed for years, and described road conditions that seemed to be based on outdated information. David thanked Frank for his help and drove back onto Highway 50, feeling refreshed and ready to complete the remaining portion of his journey. The service he had received at the Sinclair station had been outstanding, reminiscent of the kind of customer care that his father had always talked about from the golden age of American highway travel. As he merged back onto the highway, David glanced in his rearview mirror to take one last look at the station that had provided such excellent service. The station was gone. Where he had just seen the bright Sinclair sign and the warmly lit convenience store, there was nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon. David hit his brakes and pulled over, staring into his rearview mirror in disbelief. He had been looking at the station just seconds before, but now there was no trace of any structure, no glow of lights, no indication that anything had ever existed in that location. David made a U-turn and drove back to where the station should have been, but found only undisturbed desert landscape. There were no tire tracks leading to or from a service station, no concrete pads where pumps might have stood, no underground tanks or utility connections that would indicate the presence of a gas station. Most disturbing of all, there were no tire tracks from his own vehicle, despite the fact that he had just driven through that exact area minutes before. Confused and increasingly frightened, David checked his fuel gauge and found that his tank was still at the quarter-empty level it had been when he first spotted the Sinclair station. According to the gauge, he had never actually purchased any gasoline. But when he checked his wallet, he found that his cash was missing, the exact amount he had paid for gas and snacks at a station that apparently didn't exist. The ATM receipt was still in his pocket, time-stamped just 20 minutes earlier, but it showed a transaction from a machine that was nowhere to be found. David drove to the next confirmed gas station, which according to his GPS was 43 miles ahead in the town of Ely. During that drive, he had plenty of time to analyze what had happened and try to find rational explanations for his experience. He considered the possibility that he had fallen asleep while driving and dreamed the entire encounter. But the missing cash and the ATM receipt suggested that something real had occurred. He wondered if he had somehow become disoriented and stopped at a different station than he thought. But his GPS showed no other fuel services within a 100-mile radius of where the encounter had taken place. When David reached the Ely station, he asked the night clerk about other gas stations along Highway 50. The clerk, a young man who appeared to be familiar with the area, confirmed that there were no Sinclair stations between Fallon and Ely, a distance of more than 150 miles. According to local knowledge and official business directories, there hadn't been a Sinclair station in that stretch of highway for over 20 years. David decided to research the history of gas stations along Highway 50 when he reached Salt Lake City. What he discovered in historical records and old highway guides was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. There had indeed been a Sinclair station at approximately the location where he had encountered Frank and the vintage convenience store. The station had operated from 1962 to 1987, serving travelers along what was then a major transcontinental route before the construction of Interstate 80 had diverted most long-distance traffic to a more northern route. The most disturbing information David found came from newspaper archives and accident reports. The Sinclair station had been the site of several mysterious disappearances during its years of operation. Travelers would stop for fuel and supplies, pay for their purchases, and drive back onto the highway, only to be found days later, stranded with empty gas tanks and no memory of where they had purchased fuel. In 3 documented cases, drivers had been found dead in their vehicles, apparently having run out of gas despite claiming to have recently filled their tanks. The station had been demolished in 1987 following a final incident in which an entire family had disappeared after stopping for gas. Their vehicle was found a week later, abandoned on a side road with empty fuel tanks and all their personal belongings intact. The family members were never found, and the case remained unsolved. Local authorities had noted that the family's credit card showed no record of any fuel purchases, despite multiple witnesses who claimed to have seen them at the Sinclair station on the night they disappeared. David also discovered that he wasn't the only recent traveler to report encounters with a Sinclair station that shouldn't exist. Online forums and travel websites contained scattered reports from drivers who described experiences similar to his own. Stopping at a vintage gas station that provided excellent service before vanishing without a trace. Most of these reports were dismissed as hallucinations caused by highway fatigue or as elaborate hoaxes. But the consistency of details across multiple accounts suggested something more substantial than simple delusions. The most unsettling aspect of David's research was learning about the attendant named Frank. According to employment records from the original Sinclair station, there had been a full-time attendant named Frank Morrison, who worked the overnight shift from 1962 until his death in 1975. Morrison had been found dead in the station office one morning, apparently having suffered a heart attack during the night while serving customers. Co-workers described him as dedicated to providing the best possible service to travelers, and several customers had written letters to the company commending his professionalism and courtesy. David never drove Highway 50 alone again. and he changed his sales territory to avoid routes that required overnight travel through remote areas. But he kept the ATM receipt from his encounter with the phantom Sinclair station, and sometimes late at night, he would examine it and wonder about the nature of time and memory along America's loneliest highways. He never found a satisfactory explanation for what had happened to him that night. But he came to believe that some places exist outside normal time and space, maintained by the dedication of people who refuse to stop serving travelers even after death has released them from their earthly obligations. Other drivers continue to report encounters with vintage gas stations along isolated stretches of Highway 50, always providing excellent service and reasonable prices before vanishing like mirages into the desert night. Whether these stations exist as temporal echoes of a bygone era or as supernatural rest stops, for travelers who need help more than they realize, they serve as reminders that the loneliest roads in America are never truly empty, and that sometimes the best service comes from attendants who have been perfecting their customer care skills for decades beyond their natural lifespans. Let's move to our 10th story. On March 14th, 2023, the Atacama Desert Mining Consortium lost contact with 3 of their heavy transport vehicles during what should have been a routine ore delivery run along Chile's Ruta 5, the Pan-American highway that cuts through one of the most desolate landscapes on Earth. The convoy consisted of 3 massive Caterpillar 797F mining trucks, each carrying 40 tons of copper concentrate from the remote Esperanza mine to the processing facility in Antofagasta. What made this incident particularly disturbing wasn't just the disappearance of 3 enormous vehicles and their crews, but the fact that the entire event was captured through shortwave radio communications that continued for 17 minutes after the trucks had physically vanished from satellite tracking systems. The convoy was led by veteran mining truck operator Carlos Herrera, who had been driving heavy equipment through the Atacama Desert for over 22 years. Carlos was accompanied by his regular co-driver, Miguel Santos, and together they had completed this same route more than 300 times without incident. The second truck was operated by brothers Eduardo and Ramon Vega, both experienced drivers who had worked for the mining consortium for over a decade. The third vehicle was crewed by newcomers to the operation, American mining engineer Jessica Walsh and her translator, local driver Pablo Reyes, who were conducting efficiency assessments for the company's North American investors. The convoy had departed the Esperanza mine at 4:30 a.m., following standard protocol for desert transport operations. The early morning departure was designed to take advantage of cooler temperatures and calmer atmospheric conditions before the brutal midday heat created the thermal updrafts and dust devils that could make highway travel hazardous. Each truck was equipped with GPS tracking systems, satellite communication devices, and emergency beacons that transmitted their positions to the consortium's dispatch center in real time. Radio communications between the trucks and their base station were conducted in a mixture of Spanish and English, with Jessica Walsh providing periodic updates in English for the benefit of the American investors who were monitoring the operation remotely. The convoy maintained regular contact with dispatch, reporting their position, fuel consumption, and equipment status every 15 minutes according to company safety protocols. For the first 3 hours of their journey, everything proceeded exactly as planned. At 7:47 a.m., Carlos Herrera's voice crackled through the radio with the first indication that something unusual was developing. Base station, this is convoy leader. We have visual on what appears to be a significant dust storm approaching from the southeast. Estimate contact in approximately 10 minutes. Weather Service didn't predict any storm activity for this area, requesting guidance on whether to continue or seek shelter. The dispatch operator, Maria Gonzalez, immediately consulted with meteorological services and found no indication of storm activity anywhere along Ruta 5. Satellite imagery showed clear skies and normal atmospheric conditions throughout the region. However, the mining consortium's safety protocols were explicit about driver autonomy in making decisions about hazardous weather conditions, and Maria authorized the convoy to use their own judgment about whether to continue or wait for the disturbance to pass. "Base station, this is Truck 2, came Eduardo Vega's voice through the radio. "That dust cloud is moving against the prevailing wind direction. I've been driving this desert for 15 years, and I've never seen weather patterns like this. The cloud appears to be rotating in place while moving toward us. This doesn't look like any natural dust storm I've ever encountered." Jessica Walsh's voice joined the radio chatter, speaking in accented but clear English. "Base station, this is Truck 3. I'm documenting this meteorological anomaly with video equipment. The dust formation has characteristics that don't match any atmospheric phenomena in my experience. The cloud appears to have geometric structure and is maintaining perfect symmetry as it approaches our position." As the convoy continued along Ruta 5, the radio transmissions became increasingly frequent and filled with details that painted a picture of an approaching storm, unlike anything the experienced desert drivers had ever witnessed. The dust cloud was described as forming a perfect cylindrical wall that stretched from the desert floor to an estimated height of 2,000 feet. Within the cloud, the drivers reported seeing flashes of light that weren't lightning and hearing sounds that weren't thunder. Mechanical grinding and electronic interference that seemed to be transmitted through the dust itself rather than through the air. "Base station, convoy leader here," Carlos reported at 8:03 a.m. "The dust wall has reached our position. Visibility has dropped to 0, and I mean absolute 0. Our headlights aren't penetrating more than 2 feet ahead of the vehicle. GPS signals are being intermittent, and our satellite communication is experiencing severe interference. We're maintaining convoy formation using our proximity sensors and following the highway reflectors." What happened next challenged every understanding of desert weather patterns and atmospheric physics that meteorologists possessed. According to the radio transmissions, the dust storm wasn't behaving like any natural phenomenon. Instead of swirling chaotically, as dust storms typically do, the particles seemed to be moving in organized patterns, creating corridors and walls that guided the convoy along paths that diverged from the highway they had been following. "This is Truck 2, Eduardo Vega reported, his voice strained with confusion. "Our compass is spinning freely, and the GPS is showing coordinates that place us in locations that can't be correct. According to these readings, we're driving through areas that should be mountainous terrain, but the road surface remains perfectly smooth and level. The highway markers are still visible, but they're showing distances and destinations that don't match our route plan." Jessica Walsh's scientific training allowed her to provide the most detailed and disturbing observations of what the convoy was experiencing. "Base station, Truck 3 reporting. The dust surrounding us appears to be exhibiting properties that contradict known physics. The particles are maintaining perfect geometric formations and responding to our vehicle movements in ways that suggest controlled behavior rather than natural atmospheric patterns. Interior temperature of our cab has dropped to near freezing despite external temperature readings that show normal desert conditions. The radio communications continued for another 8 minutes, with each truck reporting increasingly impossible observations. Carlos described driving past highway signs that advertised destinations in languages that none of the drivers could identify, and road markers that showed distances measured in units that didn't correspond to any known measurement system. The Vega brothers reported seeing the lights of other vehicles moving through the dust. But when they attempted to establish radio contact with these other travelers, they received responses in what sounded like mechanical voices speaking in reverse. At 8:14 a.m., Jessica Walsh transmitted what would be the final clear communication from the convoy. Base station. This is Truck 3 with emergency update. Our odometers have stopped advancing, but we continue to consume fuel at normal rates. We appear to be driving through the same stretch of highway repeatedly, passing identical landmarks every 12 minutes, according to our chronometers. The dust storm has formed a perfect cylinder around our convoy, and we can see clear sky above us. But the walls of the storm extend infinitely in all directions. The final transmission came from Carlos Herrera at 8:21 a.m., his voice barely audible through increasing static interference. Base station. Convoy leader reporting final position. We can see sunlight ahead of us, and the dust is beginning to clear. We're approaching what appears to be our original route. But the landscape has changed. The mountains are in different positions, and the highway markers are... Wait, something's wrong with our trucks. The engines are running, but we're not moving anymore. Base station, please respond. Base station, can you hear us? After 8:21 a.m., all radio contact with the convoy was lost. The GPS tracking systems showed the truck's last known positions as coordinates that placed them in an area of the Atacama Desert, where the terrain was too rough for heavy vehicle operation. Satellite imagery of the location showed no sign of the dust storm that the drivers had described, and weather monitoring stations throughout the region had recorded no unusual atmospheric activity during the time period when the convoy reported encountering the storm. Emergency response teams were dispatched immediately, using helicopters and all-terrain vehicles to search the area where the convoy's GPS signals had last been detected. The search operation continued for 72 hours, covering more than 2,000 square miles of desert terrain, but found no trace of the missing trucks or their crews. The search teams reported that the terrain in the area was completely unsuitable for the operation of heavy mining vehicles, consisting of rocky outcroppings and deep ravines that would have made it impossible for the convoy to have reached those coordinates. 3 days after the disappearance, a ground search team made a discovery that defied explanation. At the exact coordinates where the convoy's GPS signals had last been recorded, they found 3 sets of tire tracks pressed into solid rock formations that geological surveys indicated were millions of years old. The tire impressions were perfectly preserved and matched the specifications of the Caterpillar 797F trucks that had disappeared. But the rock formations showed no signs of recent disturbance or alteration. Even more disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be melted metal fragments scattered around the tire impressions. Laboratory analysis revealed that the metal fragments contained alloys consistent with the construction of mining truck headlights and communication equipment. But the fragments showed signs of having been subjected to temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far higher than any natural desert conditions could produce. The most unsettling evidence came from examination of the tire tracks themselves. Forensic analysis revealed that the impressions had been made by vehicles carrying loads that exceeded the physical capacity of the missing trucks by a factor of 3. The depth and compression patterns suggested that each truck had been carrying over 120 tons of material when the impressions were made, despite the fact that the convoy had been loaded with only 40 tons per vehicle when they departed the mine. 6 months after the disappearance, mining operations in the Atacama Desert were disrupted by reports of phantom radio transmissions on the same frequencies used by the missing convoy. Multiple mining operations reported hearing Carlos Herrera's voice requesting assistance and reporting their position. But the transmissions came from coordinates that placed the convoy in locations hundreds of miles from any known roads or mining sites. The voices were always clear and urgent, describing continued attempts to navigate through dust storms and reach their scheduled destination. Atmospheric scientists who studied the case concluded that the radio transmissions could not be explained by any known propagation phenomena. The signals appeared to originate from specific geographic coordinates, but showed no decrease in strength with distance, suggesting a transmission source that violated basic principles of radio wave physics. Most disturbing was the fact that the transmissions always lasted exactly 17 minutes, the same duration as the original emergency communications from the convoy. Local indigenous communities in the Atacama Desert were consulted about historical accounts of unusual phenomena in the area where the convoy disappeared. Tribal elders shared stories passed down through generations about places in the desert where time moved differently, and where travelers could become lost between one moment and the next. According to these traditional accounts, certain atmospheric conditions could create doorways between different versions of the same landscape, allowing people to travel into places that existed alongside but separate from the normal world. The mining consortium eventually suspended operations along that section of Ruta 5, citing safety concerns and equipment losses that made continued use of the route economically unfeasible. But independent truck drivers and mining operations continue to report encounters with a convoy of 3 massive vehicles traveling through dust storms that appear and disappear without meteorological explanation. These sightings always occur during the early morning hours, and witnesses describe seeing the truck's headlights moving through clouds of dust that seem to follow geometric patterns rather than natural wind dynamics. The case remains officially classified as an industrial accident involving equipment failure and crew fatalities. But no bodies were ever recovered, and no wreckage was ever found. The tire tracks in the ancient rock formations have been protected as a research site, though attempts to remove samples for further analysis have been unsuccessful. The impressions appear to exist only when observed directly, disappearing from photographs and 3-dimensional scans as if they exist in a different dimension than the equipment used to document them. Carlos Herrera's family still receives his paychecks from the mining consortium, automatically deposited according to company policy for missing employees whose status has not been officially determined. His bank account shows regular withdrawals for fuel and food purchases, all made at locations along Ruta 5 in the Atacama Desert, suggesting that somewhere in the vast emptiness of one of Earth's most inhospitable landscapes, the convoy continues its endless journey toward a destination that may exist only in the space between moments, forever trying to complete a delivery that was interrupted by a dust storm that followed rules known only to the desert itself. Let's move to our 11th story. On September 22nd, 2023, Death Valley National Park rangers received an automated distress signal from a tour bus traveling along California Route 190, the main highway that cuts through the heart of one of the most extreme environments in North America. The signal originated from a GPS beacon registered to Desert Adventures Tours, a reputable company that had been operating guided excursions through Death Valley for over 15 years without a single major incident. What park rangers discovered when they responded to the distress call would become the most thoroughly documented and inexplicable case in the history of the National Park Service, challenging everything they thought they knew about the physical laws that govern even the harshest landscapes on Earth. Ranger Patricia Williams was conducting her regular morning patrol along Route 190 when she received the emergency dispatch at 9:34 a.m. The automated distress signal had been triggered by the tour bus's onboard safety system, indicating that the vehicle had come to a complete stop and that emergency protocols had been activated. According to the GPS coordinates transmitted by the beacon, the bus was located at mile marker 23, approximately 15 miles west of Furnace Creek, in an area known for its extreme temperatures and complete lack of natural shade or water sources. Williams immediately proceeded to the coordinates provided by the distress beacon, expecting to find a tour bus with mechanical problems or heat-related medical emergencies among the passengers. Death Valley was notorious for vehicle breakdowns caused by the extreme temperatures, and the Park Service maintained specialized equipment and protocols for rescuing stranded tourists who underestimated the lethal nature of the desert environment. As she approached mile marker 23, Williams could see the tour bus clearly visible on the highway ahead, its hazard lights flashing in the desert sun. The bus appeared to be a standard 40-passenger motor coach operated by Desert Adventures Tours, painted in their distinctive blue and white livery with large windows designed to provide panoramic views of the desert landscape. The vehicle was positioned properly on the right shoulder of the highway, and Williams could see that the engine was still running, as evidenced by the heat shimmer rising from the exhaust pipe and the operation of the air conditioning units mounted on the roof. Everything about the scene suggested a routine mechanical stop or passenger emergency. Williams parked her Ranger vehicle behind the tour bus and approached the front entrance, expecting to be greeted by the driver or tour guide who would explain the nature of their emergency. But as she climbed the steps into the bus, she encountered something that defied every assumption she had made about the situation. The bus was completely empty of passengers, but all of their personal belongings remained exactly where they would have been if the tourists had simply vanished mid-journey. Every seat contained evidence of recent occupation. Personal items were scattered throughout the cabin: cameras, water bottles, guidebooks, sunglasses, and snacks that passengers had been consuming during their tour. Cell phones were plugged into charging ports, some still displaying active text message conversations or social media posts that had been interrupted mid-sentence. Purses and backpacks remained on seats or in overhead compartments, their contents undisturbed, and valuable items like wallets and jewelry left completely accessible. What made the scene even more unsettling was the fact that many of the personal items showed signs of having been abandoned in the middle of specific activities. A crossword puzzle was half completed, with a pen still lying across the page as if the person working on it had been interrupted mid-word. A thermos of coffee was still warm to the touch, and a sandwich on one of the seats had a single bite taken out of it, the bread still soft and showing no signs of having been exposed to the desert air for any extended period. Williams called for backup and began a systematic search of the bus, looking for any clues about what had happened to the passengers and crew. The driver's seat was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition and all systems were operating normally. The tour guide's microphone was lying on the dashboard, still connected to the bus's public address system, and Williams could see that it had been switched on as if someone had been in the middle of providing commentary to the passengers. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of the bus's internal security camera system, which had continued recording throughout the incident. Williams accessed the digital recording system and found footage that documented the final minutes before the passengers disappeared. But what she saw challenged every rational explanation she could conceive. The timestamp on the recording showed normal tour activities until exactly 9:31 a.m., when all 37 passengers and 2 crew members were clearly visible in their seats, listening to tour commentary and taking photographs through the windows. At 9:32 a.m., something extraordinary happened. The interior temperature of the bus, which had been maintaining a comfortable 72 degrees Fahrenheit through the air conditioning system, suddenly dropped to what the bus's environmental sensors recorded as 47 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature change was instantaneous and uniform throughout the vehicle, with no gradual cooling period that would be expected from mechanical failure or external weather conditions. Passengers can be seen in the video footage reacting to the sudden cold, reaching for jackets, and commenting to each other about the unexpected temperature change. The video shows the tour guide, Maria Santos, attempting to contact the bus driver about the air conditioning malfunction, but receiving no response from the front of the vehicle. At 9:33 a.m., Maria walked toward the driver's seat to investigate the problem, and the security camera captured her expression of confusion and growing alarm as she discovered that driver Robert Chen was no longer at the controls. The bus was still moving at normal highway speed, maintaining its lane perfectly. But no one was steering the vehicle. What happened next was captured in horrifying detail by multiple camera angles throughout the bus. At exactly 9:34 a.m., passengers began disappearing in a specific pattern, starting from the rear of the bus and moving forward row by row. The disappearances were instantaneous. One moment a person was clearly visible in their seat, and the next moment they were simply gone, leaving behind their personal belongings, then no indication of where they had gone or how they had left the vehicle. The security footage shows that the passengers who were still present remained completely unaware that their fellow travelers were vanishing. Those who remained continued their normal activities, looking out windows, taking photographs, and conversing with each other as if nothing unusual was happening. Even when people disappeared from seats directly adjacent to other passengers, those who remained showed no recognition that anyone was missing. Maria Santos was the last person to disappear, vanishing at 9:34 a.m., exactly 3 minutes after she had first noticed the temperature drop. The final frames of the security footage show her standing in the center aisle, looking directly at one of the cameras with an expression of absolute terror. Her mouth open as if she was screaming, though the audio recording captured no sound at all. Then she simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only her microphone and the empty bus traveling down Route 190 under its own momentum. The bus continued traveling for another 3 minutes after the last passenger disappeared, maintaining perfect lane discipline despite having no driver. The vehicle's onboard computer systems continued to operate normally, with the GPS tracking system recording its position and the automatic distress beacon activating when the bus finally came to a stop at mile marker 23. The security cameras showed the empty vehicle sitting on the highway shoulder, hazard lights flashing, air conditioning still running, maintaining an internal temperature of exactly 47 degrees Fahrenheit. Williams immediately contacted Death Valley National Park headquarters and the FBI, recognizing that the disappearance of 39 people required resources beyond what the Park Service could provide. Within 4 hours, the site was swarming with federal investigators, forensic specialists, and equipment designed to analyze every aspect of the abandoned tour bus. The investigation would continue for 6 months, involving multiple agencies and some of the most advanced analytical techniques available to law enforcement. Forensic analysis of the bus revealed no signs of violence, struggle, or mechanical sabotage. Every system on the vehicle was functioning perfectly, and there were no traces of hazardous chemicals, explosives, or any other substances that might explain the disappearances. Most puzzling was the fact that the bus's fuel consumption, odometer readings, and engine wear patterns were all consistent with normal operation, showing no evidence of the extended periods of unmanned travel that the security footage had documented. The temperature anomaly recorded by the bus's environmental systems became a central focus of the investigation. Climate control experts determined that there was no mechanical explanation for the sudden 25-degree temperature drop that had occurred throughout the vehicle. The air conditioning system was not capable of producing such rapid cooling, and external weather conditions had been stable with no atmospheric phenomena that could account for the temperature change. DNA analysis of the personal items left behind confirmed the identities of all 39 missing persons, but provided no clues about their fate. Fingerprints, hair samples, and other biological evidence were exactly where they should be if the passengers had simply evaporated from their seats. There were no signs of any struggle or attempt to leave the vehicle, and all personal belongings remained in the exact positions where they had been when their owners disappeared. The FBI's technical analysis team made one discovery that added an additional layer of impossibility to the case. The bus's electronic systems had recorded fluctuations in electromagnetic fields during the 3-minute period when passengers were disappearing. These field variations followed patterns that resembled the signatures associated with high-energy physics experiments, but at power levels that would require equipment far beyond anything that could be concealed or operated in a desert environment. Most disturbing was the discovery that the security camera footage contained information that challenged basic assumptions about the nature of recorded evidence. When investigators analyzed the video frame by frame using advanced digital enhancement techniques, they found that some frames contained images of people who were not on the tour bus passenger manifest. These additional figures appeared to be standing in the aisles or looking through windows, but they were only visible for single frames and appeared to be wearing clothing from different time periods. The search for the missing passengers expanded to cover more than 1,000 square miles of Death Valley, using helicopters, ground teams, search dogs, and thermal imaging equipment. Despite the most comprehensive search operation in the park's history, no trace of any of the 39 missing persons was ever found. The search teams reported several anomalous discoveries, including areas where their electronic equipment malfunctioned and zones where the temperature was significantly lower than surrounding areas. But these phenomena provided no clues about the fate of the disappeared tourists. 6 months after the incident, Desert Adventures Tours went out of business, unable to continue operations in the face of lawsuits and insurance claims related to the disappearances. The tour bus itself was impounded as evidence and eventually became the subject of scientific studies conducted by universities and research institutions interested in unexplained phenomena. Researchers discovered that the vehicle's interior temperature remained at exactly 47 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of external conditions or attempts to adjust the climate control system. The case remains officially open, classified as a multiple missing persons investigation with no active leads. The families of the disappeared passengers continue to search for answers, and several have reported receiving phone calls and text messages from the missing tourists' phone numbers, though telecommunications companies insist that the phones in question were destroyed or lost and are not capable of making calls. Local Shoshone tribal elders, when consulted about the incident, shared traditional stories about places in Death Valley where the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of spirits becomes thin. According to these accounts, certain locations and conditions can create doorways that allow people to step from one reality into another, sometimes voluntarily and sometimes without their knowledge or consent. The elders suggested that the tour bus had encountered one of these doorways during a moment when the spiritual energy of the desert was particularly strong. Route 190 through Death Valley remains open to traffic, but tour companies have largely avoided the area where the bus was found. Independent travelers occasionally report encountering an empty tour bus parked along the highway, its hazard lights flashing and air conditioning running. But these sightings are always brief, and the bus disappears when witnesses attempt to approach or photograph it. Park rangers continue to investigate these reports, but have never been able to locate the vehicle or determine whether these sightings represent the original bus or some kind of residual phenomenon. The most unsettling aspect of the case may be the fact that it represents a complete violation of one of the most fundamental assumptions about reality: that people cannot simply cease to exist without leaving some trace of where they have gone. 39 human beings vanished from a controlled environment under circumstances that were thoroughly documented by multiple recording systems. Yet no explanation has ever been found that can account for their disappearance within the known laws of physics and biology. Death Valley continues to attract millions of visitors each year, drawn by its stark beauty and reputation as one of Earth's most extreme environments. But for those who know about the empty tour bus, the desert holds an additional mystery. The possibility that some journeys through this ancient landscape may lead to destinations that exist beyond the boundaries of the world. We think we understand, places where the missing passengers of Desert Adventures tours may still be traveling through a death valley that exists only in the space between heartbeats, forever trying to complete a tour that was interrupted by forces older and more powerful than human comprehension.